new money has appeared. The original depositors still have their 100,000 credits because with the way the fractional reserve banking system works, they can all, on an individual level, withdraw their 10,000. But simultaneously, the watermelon farmer has 7,500 very real credits. If you have a roommate that you agree to share your blender with, only one blender physically exists, but 2 blenders worth of value is being extracted from it because you're both using it just as much as you'd use your own dedicated blender. That's essentially what's happening with money, except that with money, we track the per person value rather than the per blender value. Now, it'd be easy to argue that we can't consider the bank to have created 10,000 credits, and that's fair because the system wouldn't work if it lent 10,000 because it couldn't give the original depositors their money back. But it does work when they give away 7,500. A 25% reserve ratio is very typical in a fractional reserve banking system, so we can at least say 7,500 was created. You could still argue that the 7,500 isn't actually money since it's eventually owed back to the depositors, except that if you trust and engage in the global financial system, that's not what you believe. When you receive a loan, you can take out that money in cash, and when you deposit money in a bank account, you can take out that money in cash. It is very real money representing very real value. This is exactly why answering the question of how much money exists is so tough. There are at least 6 different commonly accepted definitions incorporating different combinations of currency, demand deposits, travel, checks, time deposits, and more, and this means of money creation is one of the primary activities that central banks like the Federal Reserve, Bank of England, or Bank of Japan seek to administer and regulate. They're in charge of telling banks how much money they have to keep in reserves, which throttles how much money appears out of thin air through banks' lending process. Of course, the aspect to take note of is the fact that money is created when it moves. Money is never created while it's sitting still. So back in 1867, when moving money was tough and banks were rudimentary, physical currency still pretty well correlated to the total supply of money. Most dollars were represented by a physical bill or coin. But since then, well, things have changed. Abstraction helps money move. Adding paper stand-ins for precious rare minerals speeds up the transportation of funds and transactions. Abstraction helps money grow, too, as a bank's ability to loan money provides its customers the assets to then create value. Abstraction, however, doesn't alone move money from one bank to the next, one town to the next, one state to the next, or one country to the next like it does today. That required standardization. Before the Civil War, there were thousands of different types of paper money backed by all sorts of private and public institutions in the US. Say, for example, a watchmaker from Waltham, Massachusetts in 1857 went into their bank to withdraw this $20 bill to buy some machinery down in Brookline. This isn't the $20 bill anyone today is used to. This is a Waltham Bank $20 bill, redeemable in gold at only the Waltham Bank, but of uncertain value to anyone outside of the Waltham Bank. Now, while the watchmaker's not taking on the risk or inconvenience of carrying 20 Waltham dollars worth of gold, there's also no guarantee that the merchant in Brookline will take the note from a bank so far out of their way. Perhaps because of the distance, they'll tack on a fee for the inconvenience of cashing the note and say the machinery is now 23 Waltham dollars. Or perhaps the watchmaker gets lucky and they are only one of many business relations the Brookline merchant keeps in the Waltham area, then maybe the merchant will accept the Waltham dollars knowing they'll be able to use the bill in the future. Regardless of the fate of the Waltham watchmaker, what their predicament underscores is that money, when in many different forms from many different places, was hard to move, hard to transact with, and hard to transfer outside of one's immediate community. All this changed with the National Currency Acts of the 1860s. Out went thousands of separately backed private banknotes, in came nationally chartered banks, and so began a new era of money moving with a new means with which to do it: the modern check. Under the new rules, all nationally chartered banks had to carry about 25% of their liabilities in reserve. In other words, of all the money they were good for, a quarter of that needed to be held in gold in the basement. If you were in Las Vegas in January 2023, sitting in the audience of the opening keynote of CES, perhaps the most influential tech conference in the world, you likely had one question on your mind.
Why is John Deere here?
After all, they're the tractor company, right? They make machines that push and pull and move and dig. That's their thing, right? Well, not according to their CEO, John May.
We've quickly become one of the world's leading robotics and AI companies. Our solutions leverage technology like computer vision, advanced sensing and compute, machine learning, and data analytics.
There's one key word there: solutions. That's a word that gets thrown around a lot by companies like Apple.
Logic Pro provides a great solution.
A sophisticated lens solution.
This solution helps deliver.
Microsoft.
We provide an end-to-end tooling solution.
The deceptively simple solution.
The best end-to-end solution.
Google.
Bespoke AI solutions.
Open sourcing solutions.
A great solution.
This linguistic mimicry, their mere attendance at an event like CES, it's all peculiar for a tractor company. Unless, does John Deere think it's a tech company? Well, yes, they do. At least according to themselves, in this LinkedIn post, sharing an article entitled, "John Deere, We're a Technology Company." And that assertion appears increasingly less absurd. While the company lays off hundreds in its manufacturing plants, it's simultaneously staffing up its tech divisions. Of 15 current US job listings, 12 are in software, data, or robotics, just 3 in manufacturing. The company has been going through a metamorphosis from one that makes machines to one that makes solutions. Apple, for instance, does not merely make computers or phones or tablets. They make integrated technology solutions, blending software, hardware, and services into an ecosystem that envelops one's digital experience. Correspondingly, John Deere no longer merely makes tractors or combines or loaders, but rather integrated production solutions, blending software, hardware, and services into an ecosystem that envelops a farmer's day-to-day experience. At the extremes, the company appears entirely disconnected from its original form as a small Illinois storefront selling shovels and pitchforks. Never could John Deere himself have imagined that his company would eventually go on to operate, for instance, a satellite network. But waxing nostalgic about humble beginnings would mask what the company now truly is. It's not an endearing family business, it's not a scrappy underdog, it's a market-domineering behemoth. It has the business of agriculture, especially in America, in a stranglehold. And so might Apple with consumer electronics, but farming is not something you pick up or put on. It's not one's digital experience, it's one's entire experience. It's your job, it's where you live, it's what your family does, it's what your neighbors do, it's what your descendants do. It is an all-encompassing way of life whose future is now being dictated by one tractor company that's decided it's big tech. But John Deere's power, their influence, their ability to change the course of history has been centuries in the making. It started with this: the self-scouring steel plow. Plows had existed in some form for millennia. So many millennia, in fact, that we can't even say how old they are, but by the 1800s, they had been refined into this, a single-piece cast iron plow. These could be pulled by an animal and would efficiently loosen the soil to bring nutrients to the surface before planting a fresh crop. And these worked great for the time, except for here, the American Midwest. The soil of Illinois and its neighbors was thick, moist, and rooty, in a fashion that would lead it to clump on the plow, forcing farmers to stop every once in a while to clean it off. But John Deere had an idea. He would manufacture the same plow, but of polished steel. This cut straight through the Midwestern ground with far greater ease, and the soil would shed right off rather than clump. While he was not the first to invent this concept, he was the first to start manufacturing a steel plow en masse, and his production steadily grew into the hundreds per month, and later, thousands. This innovation played an instrumental part in spreading agriculture across the region and transformed John Deere from a mere shop into a growing manufacturer. By the turn of the century, after the company had passed through the generations of the family, Deere had become a leading agricultural implements manufacturer, but the industry landscape was changing beneath them. Like the plow, tractors, as a concept, had long existed. Through the 19th century, it was typically animals like horse or oxen that pulled plows and other implements, yet around the world, across industries, animal power was being replaced by steam power. Whereas horse-drawn stagecoaches dominated the past, steam trains were now the dominant form of long-distance transport, so the logic carried that steam-powered tractors could replace animal power on farms. And they certainly could. The technology existed, but steam-powered tractors never became ubiquitous due to their high upfront and operating cost. But with the turn of the century came gas-powered tractors. Cheaper to buy, cheaper to operate. Popularity exploded. And while Deere was originally reluctant to stray beyond their agricultural implement core, they eventually realized that they had no choice if they wanted to stay relevant. They tried to design their own, and it was plenty capable, but it was just not competitive. At about twice the price of that of equivalent machines, their tractor never had any shot of commercial success, and then its designer died from pneumonia following a week of testing in the wet and cold, so John Deere rather elected to just simply buy their top competitor. With that, the Waterloo Gasoline Engine Company was folded into John Deere, and over the following years, their tractor, the Waterloo Boy, enjoyed wild success. Once again, like with the self-scouring steel plow, Deere didn't invent the technology, but they popularized it. They identified the opportunity, scaled up manufacturing, marketed successfully, and helped transform the tractor from a niche, novel technology into the solution for moving power on the farm. Over the decades that followed, the company transformed again from primarily an implement company into a machine company, offering combines and balers and planters and sprayers, essentially anything you needed to turn a field into a farm. Through much of the 1900s, they were always a significant but underdog player in the industry until the 60s and 70s, where their primary competitor, International Harvester, began to falter. And with its collapse in the 80s, John Deere took a firm lead in the industry, becoming the go-to ubiquitous source of agricultural equipment in the United States. But then, another monumental shift in the field. Like the tractor introduced the mechanical era of farming, information technology introduced farming to the digital age. And again, John Deere had to adjust on the fly. This started on June 23, 1995, when Rockwell International Corporation, traditionally a US defense manufacturer, unveiled its proprietary vision system, effectively firing the first shot of the digital farming revolution. It seems so simple now, but Rockwell's vision system was poised to usher in a new age of efficiency by using defense satellites to pinpoint and track a tractor from above, which in turn would allow a farmer to better monitor their field's yield, or when it came time to plant, better disperse seeds and spray chemicals. Precision farming had arrived, and while Rockwell was the first, competitors such as Case Corporation and AGCO Corporation were close on the company's heels. So too was Deere, which took it one step further. To the late 90s American farmer, GPS and precision agriculture was a handy tool, but still a finicky, expensive, and difficult to use luxury. It helped, but it wasn't required. At least, not until Deere made it a practical necessity. As they did when developing their tractor, Deere looked further afield for help. They started at Stanford, where the company collaborated with engineers to develop an autonomous GPS-controlled tractor. While it worked, it didn't work well enough to take to market. The problem was, 1990s GPS just wasn't accurate or dependable enough. So, more partnerships. Now Deere, along with Navcom Technology and NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab, sought to figure out how to create a more reliable positioning system to support not just yield maps, but autonomous guiding. The former a helpful tool, the latter a potentially revolutionary product. While autonomous guiding may have seemed a lofty ambition, its use case was well grounded. Before the rise of precision farming, farming was, well, remarkably imprecise. Take, for instance, actually planting a field. Now, laying down seed is actually a rather complicated process with a host of decisions to make and factors to consider, from when to seed to how to establish then plant the field's headlands and borders. But regardless of such considerations, or what crop one is even planting in the first place, each and every farmer, since the dawn of the tractor, has dealt with one major inefficiency: overlap. In farming, overlapping is practically unavoidable. As a tractor operator threads rows back and forth across their field, it's nearly impossible for there not to be slivers of field, whether it be where rows meet headlands or just between rows themselves, where the farmer doesn't pass over a small section twice. And considering the alternative, what farmers call sparing, this makes sense. If a farmer is to miss a small sliver entirely during drilling, there will, of course, be no crops. If they miss it with pesticides or fertilizer, the section's yield will drop. If they miss it during harvesting, well, that'd be an expensive and embarrassing mistake too. So, farmers overlap, but they try to do so as little as possible. Experience helps with this, as hours in the chair, along with a long established sense of pride in maintaining straight rows, keeps overlap down. So too do generally normal rectangular fields, should a farmer have such a luxury. And then there are tricks: spray foams to mark areas already hit, guideposts along fences for visual reference, thoroughly laid out tractor paths calibrated to align with the width of the farmer's equipment. But tricks only go so far. One study has put numbers on the overlaps. Across the study's 17 locations and 4 years of planting, the combine driller overlapped at 7.7%, spin disc fertilizer at 9.5%, while the sprayer overlapped at 15.7%, and the cultivator reached 19%. At every step of the process of growing something then, the farmer's overlap is costing them. 8% of their seed is being wasted, 10% of their expensive fertilizer is being overapplied, nearly 16% in pesticide and herbicide is doing more harm than good, and almost a fifth of their field is being turned over by the cultivator for no reason. This means more material. It also means more fuel, it means more time in the field and in the chair, it means more hours put on the machines, and therefore more hours in the shop and fewer functional seasons. Such costs really add up, as a bad year will see costs outpace income, while 10-year averages, in the case of 2010 to 2019, will only net meager 11.8% profit margins. With such touchy and tight finances, unnecessarily wasting 8 to 19% of one's time and money on overlapping is a massive inefficiency, one that Deere was seeking to address at the dawn of a new century. The answer was called Starfire, which, by correcting notoriously inaccurate GPS data with ground location data, offered farmers field mapping accurate to within 3 feet or 1 meter, rather than the 10 to 30 foot or 3 to 10 meter accuracy of traditional GPS. With further work on the product, by 2004, Starfire 2 provided accuracy within 1.5 inches or 4.5 centimeters. Through the collaboration with Stanford, NASA, and Navcom, who they eventually acquired, Starfire positioned the company again on the cutting edge of the precision farming revolution. Not only did their product provide superior accuracy for yield and seed mapping, it was accurate enough to address the fundamental inefficiency of overlapping. Simply equip a machine with a Starfire receiver and a monitor, then purchase Deere's AutoTrack program, and farmers could now guide by precise lines laid out on a screen and even let the autonomous feature take the wheel. Today, through a combination of 6 uplink sites on 3 continents, 46 reference sites around the globe, and leased bandwidth from Inmarsat satellites, the Shovel and Pitchfork company is able to provide greater accuracy than the public global positioning alternative, optimizing every single thread and turn across a farmer's field. The influence of such guidance can't be understated. Only 10% of farmers used any sort of auto-steer and guidance system in 2004, but as of 2019, those numbers stood in the mid-50 to 60% range, and on bigger 1,000-acre farms where the economies of scale blunt the upfront cost and the waste of overlap is only magnified, adoption rates of such systems have reached over 80%. By applying the same playbook they did with the plow and the tractor, embracing and perfecting new technology through upfront R&D investment, while also acquiring sector leaders like Navcom, Deere helped push farming into a new epoch. But that epoch isn't over, and Deere's only dug themselves further into the digital turn. Across the dozen American companies Deere has acquired since 2007, only 4 are traditional hardware manufacturers. The rest, broadly, are in tech and increasingly in artificial intelligence, machine learning, and automation. In 2017, for just north of $300 million, Deere purchased Blue River Technology, who had recently been testing their new product called See & Spray, what they called the world's first smart sprayer, which, by feeding hundreds of thousands of plant images through deep learning algorithms, was capable of identifying crops and weeds before then spraying herbicide within a quarter-inch accuracy. Not long after, Deere's See & Spray Select entered the market. Then, in 2022, See & Spray Ultimate became available for factory installation on 2023 model 410R, 412R, and 612R sprayers. With a camera positioned along every meter of the carbon fiber spray boom, the product would reduce spray volume by 2/3, saving money on herbicides and, by extending trips between refills, saving time and fuel. The benefits of the next step in precision agriculture also provided an environmental benefit beyond the farmer too, as this product, the company projected, would reduce the airborne drift of chemicals by up to 87% and chemical runoff by up to 93%. In this new era of AI and machine learning precision farming, John Deere was not the first, as a Dyson subsidiary entered the smart spray space earlier. Nor is it alone, as AgZen, a commercial outgrowth of MIT research, is pushing into the space too. Whether John Deere wins out here, as they have so many times in the past with new technological innovations, remains to be seen, but given their history, it feels like a safe bet. Regardless of competition though, this service, capable of plugging right into the broader John Deere ecosystem, should be a boon for the American farmer conscious of cost, yield, and overall environmental impact of their work. Or at least, that's what it would seem. By standard metrics, farming in the US has gotten better across the sector's digital revolution. We're wasting less, making better informed decisions, and growing more than ever. Just look at average yields for corn, soy, and cotton. But consider the position of the American farmer. In the past, being an all-green farm, that is, running strictly John Deere equipment, was a point of pride. Today, though, it's increasingly feeling like an expensive necessity without alternatives. Newfound hyper-efficiency comes with a cost, or really a whole host of costs. Say an Illinois soy farmer is sizing up purchasing a See & Spray attachment. Well, first they'll have to have a fairly new sprayer to begin with, which if they don't have, will be in the ballpark of $50,000. Then add on another $25,000 for equipment and install, which can only be done at an authorized dealership. Still, given that soybean pesticides have reached an all-time high this decade, coming in at $77 per acre in 2022, and given that this farmer owns the median-sized farm for the state at 4,500 acres, considering scale, such an upfront investment may well be worth it. Without See & Spray, pesticides would cost $350,000. With the product, assuming it cuts spraying down to a third, a farmer would only need about $117,000 in pesticides. So with upfront costs, savings total about $62,000. But then another cost. See & Spray subscriptions cost $4 per acre, so cut out another $18,000 and the economics become slightly less appealing. And then there's the less tangible costs. Fundamentally, precision agriculture is changing what it means to be a farmer. What was once an occupation defined by individual autonomy, problem-solving, and improvisation is now increasingly beholden to monitors, screens, software subscriptions, and the availability of manufacturer-authorized technicians. Undoubtedly, this is an issue of nostalgia, but it permeates in costly and frustrating ways too. Consider the solar storms that pushed northern lights as far south as the American Midwest. While it might have been a once-in-a-lifetime experience for farmers who stayed up late to see it, it caused far more costly problems when the storm knocked out their navigational systems. Just at the moment farmers needed to be out planting corn, their precision navigation systems failed them. While solar storms are few and far between, issues with software programs and machinery that's now more complicated than ever are far too common and far too difficult to get figured out for your lifelong farmer. Rather than hauling a tractor back to the barn to fix a hydraulic leak and get back out on the field that same day, when new era hardware fails, there's a good chance a farmer will, if it's on the technology side of the machine, which has the far more finicky side, it likely is. So rather than fixing it and getting back out on the field, a farmer is left waiting for an authorized technician who will be expensive to pay and costly on time, as it's unlikely they'll be available at the drop of a hat. And all that's without considering whether the farmer has the tools and information to make the fix in the first place, which is also a matter of contention. Across the past decade, John Deere has found itself in the middle of a battle over the right to repair. For those savvy enough or bold enough to fix their own issues, they often need access to the diagnostic software to begin with, which is something Deere's been slow to hand over. Their stated reason to keep software restricted is a matter of liability and responsibility. If they hand over the keys, they figure, their machines might get used and altered in ways they shouldn't. But for an increasingly holding of key information is simply another way to make sure that farmer is also on the hook for costly repair bills that make their way back to Deere, thus providing the company yet another revenue stream. Regardless as to who is really telling the truth, what's undeniable is that the farmer is as financially squeezed as ever, and with the rise of big tech and farming, they are increasingly being moved out of the driver's seat. But Deere is facing their own financial pressure. Competition is rising, so they have to adapt to maintain their relevance. Over the past decade, venture capital money has poured into startups that insist they can disrupt the world of food production. Whereas in 2013, there were 42 funds focused on the agri-food space, today there are almost 300, reaching a peak of $53 billion of investment in 2021. A simple thesis is presented to potential investors. The global share of land dedicated to agriculture is peaking as more and more of the world urbanizes, yet simultaneously, the global population is expected to continue increasing for at least half a century more. Therefore, it is objectively true that we will have to produce more from less, and these startups believe the way to do that is through technological innovation. Different companies have different solutions to this problem. Some are focused on controlled environment agriculture, growing indoors to eliminate the threats and resource losses from the outdoors. Others are leveraging big data analytics and machine learning to remove the inefficiencies of guesswork, while still others are working to increase outdoor production yields and lower labor costs through various forms of autonomy. Building on early successes in precision agriculture, John Deere has committed to developing a fully autonomous production system for corn and soybean by 2030. That means every step from plowing through planting through harvest without direct human involvement. And that's remarkably believable. Corn and soybean are planted in straight rows with relatively high distance between each plant, meaning there's already the predictability and margin for error that makes it easiest for autonomous systems to succeed. The combination of innovations like precision agriculture, indoor growing, autonomous production, and more will yield amazing benefits for us all. In sum, they create a food production system that is less expensive and less resource intensive. But they come at a cost, a very literal, incredibly significant upfront cost. The economics of paying an exorbitant amount for a fully autonomous wheat production system work out first for the absolute largest farms. Just as with See & Spray, every innovation promises to improve efficiency by a certain small percent, so the larger the overall operation, the more valuable that small percent can be, and therefore the more likely the upfront cost is worth it. So innovations can be worth it, but only if you grow a ton of food. This has been true for a while. There have been greater and greater economies of scale in agriculture, which has contributed to a long-term trend of consolidation. Over the past 25 years, the average size of an American farm has grown by 7%, even as total farmland has declined 8%. As small farms face increasing cost pressure by more efficient big ag operations, they either shut down or sell their land to big ag. And as big tech encroaches into farming, innovation is accelerating, which is great by itself, but this leaves the small family farm behind. A layperson's perception of farming as a mom and pop living in a homestead in Kansas, working the fields around, answering to no boss but themselves, is becoming a cinematic fiction. Increasingly, those living in regions dominated by agriculture work not for themselves, but for landowners holding hundreds of thousands of acres. Often, the owners of this land live time zones away, meaning profits from production are not spent at the local diner or car dealership, but rather distributed to a multitude of investors and left to sit in mutual funds. This contributes to a further gutting of the economy of rural America. One of the rare ways to build a business outside of cities is becoming an increasing impossibility, and rural resources are being extracted for urban gain. This is, in many ways, inevitable. Tech innovation across essentially any industry has primarily benefited larger corporations and incentivized consolidation. Farming, being so far from urban areas and so culturally isolated from Silicon Valley, has long been shielded from these forces. Yet today, John Deere and others have recognized the upside of bringing these two worlds together. But this progress will hurt. The death of the family farm is upon us, and the autonomous tractor sits just beyond the horizon, waiting to unleash its destructive ability to incrementally optimize yields. The reason why John Deere's See & Spray technology is so powerful is that it's able to interpret visual information and make decisions on what a given plant needs in an instant at a huge scale. What makes this possible behind the scenes is a neural network. The software was fed millions of images and taught to interpret them as a human would. Neural networks are fascinating as they're essentially recreating a brain in a digital environment, and they're also some of the most wide-scale instances of machine learning right now, so it's worthwhile to understand how they work. And for that, there's our sponsor, Brilliant.org. Their class on neural networks starts by teaching very basic principles through interactive problem-solving exercises and straightforward intuitive explanations, and then goes on to bring these concepts together into practical applications. I really think they understand how to make learning more effective and more engaging, so they're perfect if you're the person who likes to learn a lot efficiently. In addition to their classes on AI topics like neural networks and large language models, they have dozens more in math, computer science, data analysis, and other STEM subjects, each thoughtfully designed.
All right, so there is a battle for the new monetary order between gold and Bitcoin. Right now, it's not really looking good for Bitcoin.
If Bitcoin falls 90% for the next 4 years, we'll refinance the debt.
Refinance where, Michael?
We'll just roll it forward. I mean, again...
But you think banks would lend to you at that point?
Yeah, because...
Okay, so let me explain what's happening. For the past several decades, the world worked with a very specific monetary structure. In order to grow the economy and expand something called the GDP, we had to expand the debt. And in order to expand the debt, we had to grow the money. And as that system got bigger and bigger, most of the world's capital flowed through the US dollar and into financial assets like the US stock market. That's also why stocks have outperformed almost every other investment. And Bitcoin was born into this world during this expansionary period of time. All this endless money printing. And now that system is sort of coming to a breaking point. Because debt isn't just growing, it is now exploded. And it's starting to outgrow the economies that are supposed to support it. And so something called the global old rules-based order is coming to an end.
The international order based on rights and rules no longer exists.
Now, throughout history, when this happens, money looks for something called the safest neutral asset. And what does that mean? A neutral asset is something that's not tied to a specific country or a government. It's outside the system. And historically, those have been assets with a finite supply. And for thousands of years, that was mostly gold. And in the modern era, a lot of people believed that Bitcoin was supposed to be the digital equivalent, right? So the world thought, okay, well, if we don't know what's gonna happen, and we don't know what the new system is gonna look like, then the hardest asset is usually the safest bet. And because Bitcoin is digital and portable and finite, a lot of people also thought it would outperform everything else, including gold. Except that's not what's happening right now. Gold is breaking out to new highs. Central banks are buying physical gold at the fastest pace in decades. And at the same time, Bitcoin has actually lost value relative to gold. So the question is, well, if we're really going into this new multipolar world, and if countries and people are really losing confidence in US treasuries and the dollar and maybe even the stock markets, then why is gold leading right now? Why is it that the asset that was to represent the future monetary standard getting left behind? And if this keeps going, how low is Bitcoin gonna go? Maybe the most important question, is this temporary? Or is this the start of what some people call a capital rotation event, which could last for more than a decade? Now, these are all very interesting questions, and I'm gonna try to answer some of them using the latest data and analytics, and hopefully at the end, you'll be able to better understand what's happening in this crazy world. So with that said, let's get into it. Hi, my name is Andre Jick. Hope you're doing well. Come for the finance and stay for the gold and for the Bitcoin. So I want to explain what's happening to gold and Bitcoin through the lens of two big forces. This will get extra nerdy, but we're gonna use the macro force and something called the technical force. And the easiest way to understand what they are is to compare them and give you an analogy to physics. Now, in physics, you have something called the theory of general relativity, which explains gravity and the curvature of space and time. Basically, it explains the movements of big objects like planets and galaxies. I think of this as sort of like the macro force. It's very slow, and it sort of guides the general direction of things over a long period of time. Well, then you have something called quantum mechanics, which explains the movements of tiny particles and atoms. It's very chaotic, and it doesn't make any sense when you compare it to how the big things move. And when I think of quantum mechanics, I think of how investment markets sometimes work. Like, they're completely unpredictable in the short term, and they don't make any sense at all to me. So the macro is the big picture stuff like the monetary order, sovereign debt levels, geopolitical changes, right? All those kinds of things that Ray Dalio talks about when he explains economics. Now, on the other side of that, though, is the technical side of the force, which is what people like Benjamin Cowan and North Star charts show us. That's the moving averages, the support levels, the ratio of Bitcoin versus gold, right? That's the particle physics inside the system. Now, in this nerdy framework of ours, gold can be explained using the macro force, the big picture stuff. What's happening to gold right now? It's gone up significantly. And what is the macro evidence of that? Well, we know that government debt relative to the GDP is now higher than almost any point in US history outside of World War II. And global sovereign debt at the same time has exploded faster than economic growth itself. Now, also thanks to the changing world order, central banks around the world have been buying physical gold at the fastest pace in modern history. In a lot of countries, gold also now makes up a bigger share of official reserves than it has in years, which means the sovereigns, or tier 1 nations with nuclear weapons, are choosing gold over other assets like US treasuries. So there's a lot of structural gravity that's pulling money toward gold, which is this neutral hard asset. It's outside of any government or currency. That gravity says gold should be strong, and it is. But based on this force, Bitcoin should be going up as well, but it's not. So Bitcoin, I think, is better explained using the technical side of the force. Now, either some of that made sense or none of it did. So let me explain it a little easier. One force is saying hard assets should be winning in this environment, and one of them is gold is winning. The other force, the technical one, is saying Bitcoin might not be done correcting yet. And that leaves us with a couple of different outcomes. Either Bitcoin is about to go onto a super cycle and form a new high and follow gold to go way higher, or we're seeing the early stages of a much bigger capital rotation event that I think most people are probably not ready for. And this is where it gets extra nerdy. And let me start with gold, but it's important to remember that when you look at all this stuff, it's not exact science. One chart that I show you is not gonna show you what's gonna happen to any one asset. Instead, it's better to look at as much information as we can to get a more accurate understanding of what might be happening. And a really good example of what I'm talking about is this chart I came across from North Star Charts. By the way, credit to Natalie Brunell and her podcast with North Star Charts. I'll leave all the links down below for you to go to the source material and check this out yourself. But the chart you're looking at right now measures a concept called CRE, or capital rotation evidence. What does that mean? It's in the name. It's a time of money rotating from one thing into another. Now, capital rotation is this idea that money goes through different cycles and phases of how and where it gets invested. And where it goes depends on a couple different things. Now, this specific chart measures the capital rotation evidence for gold. So it compares a lot of economic metrics to the price of gold. And on this chart, everything is in a bear market relative to gold. It's all in red, which means this is favorable or really good for gold. So for example, the S&P 500, aka the stock market versus gold. Gold is winning right now. The NASDAQ versus gold. Gold is also winning. The dollar versus gold. Gold is winning. M2 money supply versus gold. The consumer price index, aka inflation versus gold. Even market indexes like the Russell or the Wilshire versus gold. You get the idea. Gold is going up faster than any of these indexes. Now, by themselves, any one of these squares turning red not that big of a deal. Doesn't tell us much. But North Star argues that when we have a lot of these coincidences, in this case, all the squares have gone red against gold, that means we are now most likely in the middle of a major capital rotation event. In this case, this is when stock markets go down and potentially spend 10 or more years trying to get back to the level they were at before this event started. Now, there have been a couple times throughout history when this has happened before, and here's a few examples. During the early 1930s, when the stock market collapsed and the dollar wasn't stable, the US went through a gold reevaluation thanks to FDR confiscating it. Gold repriced higher and outperformed just about everything. Gold dominated for about 5 to 7 years, and the stock market didn't recover to its all-time high of 1929 until 1954. That's a capital rotation event. Now, it happened again in the 1970s. That was the big one, which is when the US had huge amounts of inflation. The stock market was basically flat for a decade in what's called real terms, right? AKA relative to inflation. And during that time, gold went up over 2,000%. That lasted from 1971 to about 1980. So gold dominated for about 9 years. That was a capital rotation event. It happened again in 2002 when the US went through the dot-com bust. Gold went from the mid-200s in 2001 to over $1,900 by 2011. That lasted more than a decade, and commodities went on to what people call the super cycle. So that's a capital rotation event. Now, these rotations typically last between 5 to 10 years. And during those times, the stock market can either collapse or go sideways in real terms, while hard assets got the real returns. Now, what North Star is suggesting right now is that just about every major financial metric is going down relative to gold, all at the same time. And when money starts rotating like that, it shows us that there might be a really big change in investor confidence. And when these investors prefer neutrality over financial productive assets, aka stocks, that usually means the system is absorbing the stress somewhere else, right? Like the debt levels, inflation, currency debasement, geopolitical fragmentation, all these things are going somewhere. Now, in those times of uncertainty, markets can still go up in what economists call nominally, meaning the overall number goes up. But they can also have a hard time with getting what's called a real return, right? The real purchasing power gains. And I know it sounds kind of complicated, but for example, if you get a 10% raise in your income this year, that is your nominal number. But oops, life is now 11% more expensive this year, which means your real income is actually negative 1%. It's a loss. Same thing in the markets. Markets can go up 10%, no problem, but they can still lose purchasing power in real terms. So anyway, this chart says if this rotation continues, that doesn't mean there's going to be a stock market crash necessarily. It just means that real returns get compressed relative to hard or scarce assets. So the takeaway is that investors go through different periods of how they like to invest their money. Like for example, some eras, the stocks might win, and in other eras, hard assets might win. And they tend to alternate. Okay, so that's gold. But then the question is, what about Bitcoin? And before I show you that, I want to talk about something that doesn't get enough attention in personal finance, which is building your credit. It determines the interest rate you qualify for, which directly affects how much money you keep in your own pocket long term. And if you're trying to improve or rebuild your credit, you should check out Kickoff. Kickoff is a credit building tool that helps you build credit safely and easily. Their affordable monthly plans start at just $5 a month and are specifically designed to improve key credit factors like payment history and utilization. You build credit simply by keeping your account open and making on-time payments. And with AutoPay, those payments are reported to all 3 major credit bureaus. Kickoff users who started with credit under 600 and made on-time payments saw an average increase of 25 points in their first month and up to 86 points after their first year. Now, individual results may vary, but if your credit is holding you back, Kickoff is giving my audience 80% off your first month, and that's as low as $1 to get started. Click the link in the description down below or go to getkickoff.com/Andre to check it out. Thank you to Kickoff for sponsoring this segment, and now let's get back to it. All right, so if gold is strong right now, and the big macro force says that Bitcoin should also be strong, then why isn't it? And this is where the technical force, I think, is more useful in explaining it. A lot of this framework comes from Benjamin Cowan. I'll link his work down below for Into the Cryptoverse, where you can see all of this yourself, but what really helps explain where
they're just everywhere. Whoa, this is really blue. You should come, like, this is so blue.
Look at how many you're finding.
I feel like Gollum. If it weren't so dangerous, it'd be a fun activity to do.
These are the big ones. So what about all the particles you can't see?
This same kind of material was used in the construction of the World Trade Center buildings. And when the towers fell, it was pulverized to microscopic size and released into the air. The particles remained airborne for days, and thousands of people unknowingly breathed them in. They buried themselves deep within people's lungs, wreaking havoc and causing all sorts of diseases.
We've known for decades that these particles are extremely dangerous. But when the towers fell, no one was warned.
The concentrations are such that they don't pose a health hazard.
And yet today, the diseases linked to that dust have killed more than twice as many people as the attacks themselves. Once we started looking, we kept finding this material in places we never expected.
He was telling the newspapers, people aren't just eating it and breathing it, they're mainlining it.
In popular off-roading spots, in makeup, and even kids' toys.
Say it ain't so, Mickey Mouse crayons.
No. It's been detected in the dust around schools and homes.
5 generations of people died up there.
And instead of banning it outright, we let it spread. Some countries are still importing hundreds of thousands of tons each year, and it's estimated that by 2035, nearly 2.8 million people might die because of it. This is a video about a deadly miracle material we can't stop using. This investigation is based on publicly available documents, recordings, and third-party sources. All of our links are in the description. Thank you to Ground News for sponsoring this video. More about them later. There is this story about the ancient Greeks from around the 2nd century AD. They had this golden lantern that would burn for a whole year without going out, all because of a very special wick that just wouldn't burn down. So how did they develop this technology? Well, the truth is, they didn't. They found it. Imagine you're walking around 2,000 years ago and you see this fluffy-looking stuff poking out the ground. It's got all of these fibers that you can pull apart and twist into shapes.
First off, let's get a nice bundle. So it looks like cotton.
It looks like it would burn really well. Like it would just...
Yeah, you can start a fire with it, right? All right.
Okay, let's see what happens.
But it's not burning.
That's because this is actually a rock. It's a naturally occurring mineral.
The core building block is simple. It's a silicon atom surrounded by 4 oxygen atoms.
Now, silicon has 4 electrons in its outer shell, but it really wants 8. So each of the oxygens shares 1 electron with it. But oxygen doesn't share evenly. Since it's more electronegative than silicon, it pulls those shared electrons closer to itself. This leaves the oxygen side slightly negative and the silicon side slightly positive. Now there's an electrostatic attraction between these atoms which pulls the atoms closer together and strengthens this bond. The result is an incredibly stable pyramid-shaped unit called a silica tetrahedron. But If you look at the oxygens in these corner spots, they've only shared one electron, but they actually want two to complete their outer shells. So the corners link up with other silicon atoms to form more tetrahedra, and in this way, the structure just keeps growing.
The bonds inside here are incredibly strong and stable, and because the atoms are already tightly bound to the oxygens inside the silicate structure, the oxygen in the air has nothing to react with, so the material doesn't burn.
But overall, there's nothing special about these building blocks. More than 90% of the Earth's minerals are made from this stuff, everything from quartz to clay.
What makes this material special is how those units link up.
Here, the tetrahedra have formed a sheet, and bonded to it, there is actually a second sheet made of magnesium atoms and hydroxyl groups, which are just an oxygen and a hydrogen stuck together. Now, the atomic spacings of these two layers are slightly different, so there's a tiny mismatch which causes tension between these layers, causing them to curl up, and you end up with these tiny scroll-like tubes. These tubes don't break down easily under heat. The structure stays stable up to around 600 degrees Celsius.
So like all these individual fibers that you see running through here, those are all like these scrolls?
Yes.
What is that? What was that bend?
That's just a place where I twisted the fiber with my tweezers.
Ah, okay.
And when you twist these fibers, they actually don't break. So it's literally a rock you can weave. And when you do, the fibers form a tangled layered structure. So if heat is introduced, it has to pass from fiber to fiber across many contact points, with air filling the spaces between them. This reduces how quickly heat can spread through the material. Because of that, people started weaving it into things like theater curtains and insulation blankets for steam engines, even fireproof clothing, essentially anywhere they didn't want something to catch fire.
But by far the most important use came around in the 1800s.
Between 1790 and 1870, the number of people living in urban areas in America jumped from 1 in 20 to around 1 in 4. So to accommodate this, people had to tack on extra floors onto existing buildings, and courtyards would then be filled with makeshift extensions, effectively tightly packing all of these buildings together. Pretty much all these buildings were made out of wood, but the people inside still cooked with open flames, they used gas lamps, they lit candles, so one accident and an entire neighborhood could go up in flames. In December 1835, when within a span of just 2 days, 3 separate fires erupted in Manhattan. One bystander described what followed as an ocean of fire with roaring, rolling, burning waves. By the end, a third of a mile of Manhattan was engulfed, destroying nearly 700 buildings at a cost of $20 million. That's over $730 million of today's money. Similar catastrophes were happening in cities all over the world: Chicago, London, Hamburg, Tokyo.
When will this appalling rate of destruction come to an end?
The problem was that when a building burned, it spewed up embers into the air. These then got carried by the wind and landed onto other roofs, setting them alight. So 23 years after the Great Fire of New York, a 21-year-old named Henry Ward Johns set out to break that chain reaction by making roofs fireproof. But that's trickier than it sounds. Whatever his solution was, it had to be usable across an entire city. So cheap and easy enough to mass produce, durable enough to sit exposed on rooftops, baking in the summer sun, freezing in the winter, and most importantly, it was not allowed to ignite even when exposed to burning embers. Now, Johns knew of a mineral that was already being spun into fireproof fabric, but only the long fibers were useful for thread. The shorter ones were actually swept aside as waste. Johns realized those scraps were exactly what he needed: fireproof, tough, and most importantly, cheap. So he set up a makeshift lab in his basement apartment and started experimenting. He heated up tar in his tea kettle, smeared that onto cloth, and then pressed in these tiny fibers. Then he wringed the whole thing through his wife's brand new clothes wringer, and when he tested it, it worked. It burned. In 1868, Henry Ward Johns patented his invention, and by 1927, the company he built was generating $45 million in annual sales, more than $800 million in today's money. Soon, people were using this fire-resistant stuff in all kinds of building materials. Across America, consumption grew from around 20,400 tons in 1900 to a peak of 803,000 tons in 1973. Because of that, pretty much every building in the US, public or private, commercial or residential, used some form of this material. During that same period, stronger building codes, safer heating systems, and other fire-resistant materials were also introduced, and it showed. During that time, fire-related deaths dropped around 80%. So this material likely helped save millions of lives worldwide. Because it couldn't be destroyed by fire, the name the ancient Greeks gave it, it stuck around. They called it inextinguishable, or asbestos.
Asbestos, the remarkable mineral.
By the mid-20th century, asbestos was everywhere, inside brake pads, toasters, ironing boards, hair dryers, surgical dressings and blankets. You know, brewers filtered beer through it. One brand of toothpaste even used it for extra polish. The fake snow in department store windows and in movies like The Wizard of Oz, all of that's asbestos too.
Unusual weather we're having, ain't it?
Sorry, Dorothy.
It was such a big deal, Marvel even had a villain called Asbestos Lady. She'd set a fire to escape the police, and she'd easily walk through it safe inside her asbestos bodysuit.
To feed this demand, asbestos was pulled out of the ground on an enormous scale. Major mining operations spread across Canada, Russia, and South Africa, with global production peaking at approximately 4.8 million tons per year in 1977. But the reason asbestos ended up in so many different products is because it's actually a group of different minerals. That white fluffy stuff we tried to burn earlier, it's called chrysotile, and it belongs to a mineral family known as the serpentines. But other types of asbestos looked completely different. For instance, there is also brown asbestos, known as amosite. It forms thick fibers that almost look like wood splinters, strong, stable, and highly heat resistant. So it was perfect for putting into building materials like cement panels. This type belongs to a different mineral family, the amphiboles. Here, instead of forming sheets, the silica tetrahedra lock into rigid ladder-like chains. In amosite, iron and magnesium ions, along with hydroxyl groups embedded in the structure, bind those chains together, forming these long, needle-like fibers. But tweak that chemistry just slightly so that now iron and sodium ions bind the chains, and you get this, blue asbestos, or chrysotolite. These crystals split easily along their length, and they create these fine, flexible fibers that are still extraordinarily strong with tensile strengths comparable to high-grade steel wire. This type went into chemical-resistant insulation, shipyards, and even filters inside early gas masks. Oh, and there was another use, one that's hard to believe now.
In this magic box I have right here is something that was manufactured right here in North Carolina. They're cigarettes produced in the 1950s. And if you look at the filter, you see the filters are blue. Asbestos. This is Kent with the micronite filter that was manufactured with chrysotolite asbestos in the filter itself.
So you're not only smoking, you were smoking it through a blue asbestos filter?
Yes.
What a deal.
Only Kent has the revolutionary new micronite filter you've heard so much about. Kent and only Kent filters best. Filters best. Filters best.
In the early 1900s, a young woman named Nellie Kershaw worked in a factory that spun asbestos fibers into threads. Every day, she breathed in the dust that those machines threw into the air. So by her early 30s, she was so sick she could barely breathe. And when she finally decided to ask the factory for help, they refused. They said helping out workers would set a dangerous precedent. Nellie died shortly after, at the age of just 33. Nellie's case caught the attention of pathologist Dr. William Cook. When he opened up her chest, her lungs were gray and scarred, almost blue-black, like they had a huge internal bruise. And when his scalpel passed through them, they rasped. It was like scraping against sandpaper. The tissue was full of mineral grit, and under the microscope, the cause was unmistakable. Asbestos fibers lodged into the lung tissue.
If we were to inhale some type of an asbestos fiber, I kind of think of them as like little microscopic straight arrows. They kind of just shoot down through the nose or the mouth and move down through the trachea. If we continue on going down here, we get smaller and smaller as we penetrate deeper into the lung tissue. And then you get into these alveolar sacs, these asbestos fibers, and they lodge in the tissue there. And lung secretions, enzymes, even white blood cells, they have a really hard time breaking those down.
You end up with scarring deep inside the lungs.
In 1924, Dr. Cook published the first medical description of this condition, which became known as asbestosis.
When these asbestos fibers lodge into the lungs, the body treats them like invaders. Specialized cells called macrophages move in, cells whose job it is to engulf and digest bacteria, dust, or debris. But asbestos fibers are too long and stiff to swallow. It's kind of like trying to eat a toothpick sideways. The macrophages keep trying and failing, and in the process, they release inflammatory chemicals that damage the surrounding lung tissue. So workers breathing in asbestos dust day after day accumulated more and more damage. When doctors sent by the British government examined hundreds of asbestos workers, they found that more than 25% already showed signs of lung disease. And for workers with over 20 years of exposure, that number was closer to 80%.
So in 1931, the government officially classified asbestos as a workplace hazard, making it one of the first industrial materials to be regulated for health risks.
But the new rules only covered factories where asbestos was manufactured. They didn't extend to other workers like shipbuilders, miners, or construction workers who were regularly exposed to asbestos dust. Across the Atlantic, things weren't much better. There was no binding federal asbestos rules in the States, only a recommendation.
The US Public Health Service suggested a temporary exposure limit of 5 million asbestos particles for a single cubic foot of air, which meant that a worker breathing normally could inhale over 300 million asbestos particles an hour and still be considered within guidelines.
This became especially problematic for shipyard workers when World War II broke out. Ships were packed with asbestos insulation, so workers spent their days cutting and fitting asbestos in thick clouds of fibers. And according to the guidelines of the day, these levels met the official definition of safe working conditions. In fact, asbestos was still marketed as a magic material.
A few years earlier, Time magazine actually put Johns Manville's president, Lewis H. Brown, on its April 3rd, 1939 cover. But in the early 1960s, finally, one doctor started connecting the dots on asbestos.
Dr. Irving Selikoff was running a small clinic in Paterson, New Jersey, when the local asbestos workers union asked if their members could come and see him. Before long, he'd seen multiple workers with either severe lung scarring or, more concerningly, an extremely rare cancer called mesothelioma.
But mesothelioma is strongly associated with asbestos exposure and is cancer of those cells lining the inside of the chest cavity, and most commonly it's this pleural cavity. These pleural membranes are lined with mesothelial cells. Sometimes what happens is the fibers will work their way out of the lung tissue and directly get into this cavity here, and they can literally pierce out the lungs.
They cause constant irritation, and over time, that can trigger cancerous changes in the cells that make up those linings. Selikoff needed more data to understand the scale of the problem, but factory owners refused to share medical records from their workers with him. So Selikoff had to get creative. See, during World War II, many shipyard workers employed by the Navy underwent federal background checks. Thousands of these men had been working with asbestos to insulate ships, so using surviving FBI wartime personnel records, Selikoff began tracking them down, and one by one painstakingly pieced together their medical histories. What emerged wasn't a handful of isolated tragedies, it was a pattern. That exposure proved deadlier than combat itself. 8.6 out of every 1,000 servicemen were killed in action, whereas 14 out of every 1,000 shipyard workers later died from asbestos-related cancers.
Selikoff launched a formal investigation into hundreds of asbestos insulation workers, and what he found confirmed his fears. Widespread disabling asbestosis, dozens of cases of mesothelioma, lung cancer rates roughly 7 times higher than expected, and a 3-fold increase in gastrointestinal cancers. In 1964, he organized a conference at the New York Academy of Sciences, where for the first time, all this evidence was presented publicly in one place and on the record. It marked the moment when asbestos stopped being seen as a modern miracle material and instead started being recognized as a public health crisis. But the asbestos industry fought back, trying to discredit Selikoff. Industry-funded research groups came out with papers minimizing the risk of exposure and framing Selikoff's findings as overblown. They started a coordinated PR effort to discredit him, trying to call him alarmist, and starting a rumor that he wasn't even a real doctor just because he got his medical degree out in Scotland.
But Selikoff kept going. He kept publishing data on the devastating health effects of asbestos exposure. He worked 18-hour days documenting every patient who wrote to him. He contacted policymakers, even world leaders, urging them to take action against asbestos.
Selikoff, the legendary doctor who organized this conference in the 1970s, found that intravenous drugs were being contaminated by asbestos filtration. People aren't just eating it and breathing it, they're mainlining it.
By the 1970s, no one could deny it any longer.
Miners, factory workers, shipyard insulators, people who'd been exposed decades earlier during the asbestos boom were now turning up with multiple cancers in huge numbers.
Asbestos exposure is linked to all sorts of different cancers. The lung tissue has lymphatic vessels in it. We do have them throughout your whole body. The asbestos fibers sometimes on their own can migrate into the lymphatic vessels. Sometimes the white blood cells will take it into the lymphatic system. Once you hit the lymphatic system, you have the potential to go anywhere in the human body.
Autopsies have found fibers in nearly every organ in the body. The brain, bone marrow, spleen, intestines, pancreas, prostate, ovaries, thyroid, and liver. And in every tissue those fibers reach, they set off the same chain reaction.
I'm imagining these white blood cells with personalities, and they get all mad and frustrated because they can't engulf this asbestos fiber. They've coined this term called essentially frustrated phagocytosis. They start releasing these things like reactive oxygen species. They can cause damage to surrounding cells, and really important is damage to DNA. Those cells can start dividing out of control, and they start to clump together, and we start to call those clumps of cells cancer.
US courts were flooded with lawsuits against companies like Johns Manville.
The harm asbestos caused was well documented. The information was out there. Companies should have known their products were dangerous.
They should know what's reasonably available in the public domain about the dangers of asbestos. If they can read asbestos patents, they can read asbestos pathology papers.
But the companies denied it.
What was needed was definitive evidence that the companies knew their products were killing their workers. Then an attorney, Carl Ash, noticed something strange in the 1974 report by this huge asbestos company called Raybestos Manhattan. See, in this report, the company suggested that they had actually been investigating health hazards of asbestos since the 1930s. So Ash started digging. He filed a request for internal documents, and at first, the company claimed it couldn't find much. Then, unexpectedly, Ash was handed a banker's box stuffed full of documents meticulously kept by Raybestos Manhattan's former president, Sumner Simpson.
Back in 1935, a journal contacted Simpson because they wanted to write an article about asbestosis. Shortly after, Simpson himself reached out to Johns Manville's lawyer, Vandiver Brown, saying, "I think the less said about asbestos, the better off we are." To which Brown replied, "I quite agree with you that our interests are best served by having asbestosis receive the minimum of publicity." The same papers also revealed that in the 1930s, Raybestos and Johns Manville hired an external company, Saranac Laboratories, to do studies of asbestos on animals, but the companies insisted on controlling what from those studies will be made public. As a letter from Vandiver points out,
It is our further understanding that the results obtained will be considered the property of those who are advancing the required funds, who will determine whether, to what extent, and in what manner they shall be made public. A clause to which Saranac Laboratories said yes. But after the lead researcher, who was compiling all this evidence, died in 1946, the companies agreed that nothing should be published that contained any objectionable material. Objectionable meaning any sort of indication that asbestos causes cancer. So when Saranac Laboratories finished their research, the companies took the report, edited it, and just buried the evidence. Here's an original copy of that manuscript, and you can find whole sections just crossed out. Other documents were even more damning. A Johns Manville medical official later testified that up until 1971, the company had a policy of not telling their workers if their physicals showed signs of asbestosis or asbestos-related lung cancers. And in sworn testimony, a witness recalled a meeting they had in the early 1940s with the president of Johns Manville, asking why they weren't warning workers about asbestos. As the witness recalls it, they asked, "Do you mean to tell me you would let them work until they dropped dead?" To which the president replied, "Yes, we save a lot of money that way." Once the Sumner-Simpson papers got out, they unlocked a new industrial Watergate. The industry's standard, "oh, we didn't know" defense, it simply fell apart. Comparisons were made to Big Tobacco's concealment of smoking risks. And the lawsuits surged. Each case brought new discovery, and each round of discovery exposed a wider, more coordinated cover-up. Ever since the word asbestosis started showing up in medical journals in the 1920s, Johns Manville went out to secure the market around itself. First, they acquired the biggest rock wool company. Then they acquired a firm holding the key patents to calcium silicate insulation that could be made without asbestos. Now, at the same time, companies that had non-asbestos insulation were incentivized into creating asbestos product lines. With each acquisition or inducement, another potential competitor lost the ability to denounce asbestos and say, "oh, we have an asbestos-free product." So each in turn became a member of this conspiracy of silence. That is how the asbestos industry guaranteed its survival, by ensuring no one could speak out against it.
We suggest you consider asbestos for the walls of your home.
They're business decisions, and the people who make them are businessmen. I mean, the word morality or moral obligation is almost non-existent in the corporate documents.
In 1982, Johns Manville filed for bankruptcy protection.
Manville Corporation's board of directors has determined that the corporation should file for reorganization under Chapter 11 of the Bankruptcy Act.
Not because they were broke, but in a move widely seen as a way to shield the company from a flood of asbestos lawsuits. Despite all the evidence against them, Johns Manville survived. They continue operating to this day, although they no longer produce asbestos. Between 1940 and 1980, the asbestos industry, led by Johns Manville, exposed roughly 21 million Americans to these fibers. Asbestos-related deaths amounted to at least 8,000 to 10,000 people every year, with many more suffering lifelong disease. In 1989, the EPA issued a rule to phase out almost all asbestos use in the United States, and that should have been the end of the story. But the industry sued immediately, not because anyone disputed asbestos causes cancer, that was undeniable by this point, but because of a legal technicality. See, under the law, the EPA had to prove that an outright ban of asbestos was the only solution, and that anything less than that just wouldn't cut it. This was an almost impossible feat. Now, the industry argued that they hadn't done that, and unfortunately, the US courts agreed. So in 1991, they ruled that the EPA just hadn't met this narrow legal standard. And with that, the asbestos ban was dead in the water. But by then, asbestos had become so financially and legally risky for the companies that manufactured it or used it that its overall use did actually decline. Yet, in the end, after years of trying to define and regulate asbestos, the only thing that truly stuck around was a definition, and a narrow one. Tricetyl and 5-amphiboles, because these were the only ones being mined, sold, and used in factories. Those 6 became the official asbestos minerals, and anything else, no matter how fiber-like or potentially dangerous, well, that doesn't count.
The FDA
FDA, for the first time in 50 years, considering testing for asbestos in cosmetics and talc powder.
Traces of it have now been detected in children's play sand.
Thousands of people are claiming that they developed various forms of cancer after years of using Johnson & Johnson's baby powder.
Is this all the stuff that you've collected over the years?
No, it's not all. But this box is full of all the Claire's labeled products that I found asbestos in. Everything little girls could possibly want to have their makeup in. Like, oh, I don't know. How about sparkly boxes, right?
Yeah.
And there's a cell phone.
Yes.
Right? With eyeshadows on it.
Yeah.
Right? There's asbestos in there. There's asbestos in the unicorn. There's
all
asbestos.
of that?
Yes. All of these have asbestos in them. I started seeing asbestos fibers everywhere.
Everywhere, okay.
The eyeshadows, the blush, they all had asbestos fibers, all right? Okay. Wow, okay.
What year was this?
2017.
What?
2017.
I thought it was going to be like 1980 or something. What?
Nope.
2017?
Yes.
Whoa.
And the manufacturer came back and said there's no way. And they sponsored another laboratory to look at the same samples, and they said, no, none of this counts as asbestos. It's all cleavage fragments, or sepiolite, clay, or something like that. And it was balderdash, right? I called friends all across the states and said, hey, do you have a Claire's store near you? Can you find the sparkly box, right? And send it to me, pronto. There's Claire's all in all of the malls all across America, and then I looked further, and it's all over the world. I mean, every mall, everywhere. And I ended up testing Claire's from Brazil to Japan, to London. I found asbestos.
No way.
Right. So that turned into a huge story, right? And now I don't think you can buy very much talc-based cosmetics at Claire's now. But it was a several years long battle. These are different products that were sold at toy stores. Like here's the Secret Spy Kit.
Yeah.
And you see there's a fingerprint kit there,
yes.
Right? And in that fingerprint kit was a powder in which I found asbestos fibers. Say it ain't so, Mickey Mouse crayons.
No.
I found asbestos in those.
And this keeps happening. Just a couple of months ago, around 70 schools in Australia and New Zealand had to close down because of the asbestos found in children's play sand. Out of the 60 outlets that reported on this story, only 24% were from right-leaning sources. Depending on where you get your news, this might have never crossed your radar, which is a problem because public health information like this shouldn't fall through the cracks. And this is why we've asked Ground News to sponsor this video. They compile news from outlets all over the world into one place so that you can easily see the partisan split. And with their color-coded layout, it's also easy to sort your news by factuality, ownership, and source so that you can see how a story like this is getting covered side by side with all the context you need. Take these two headlines, for example. This article from the Herald Sun only talks about the fear of asbestos, while this very high factuality source firmly states that asbestos was found in decorative sand. That difference matters. I would like to know whether the concern is over a mere suspicion or actual asbestos contamination. And that's why I find Ground News so useful. You get the full picture, not just one headline sensationalizing for clicks. And they also have a dedicated blind spot feed for stories like these that are, disproportionately covered by either side of the political spectrum, all to help people avoid their echo chambers. Now, we partnered up with Ground News because we share the same mission, getting to the truth. And that's why we're offering 40% off their Vantage plan at ground.news/VE. So if you want to support the channel, but also want a clearer understanding of the world, check out that link in the description, or you can also scan this QR code. So I want to thank Ground News for sponsoring this part of the video. And now let's go figure out why asbestos is even getting into all these consumer products. Now, no one is intentionally putting asbestos in makeup or kids' toys. So how did something we know is deadly just end up everywhere? Well, it's an unfortunate consequence of where asbestos forms, and nowhere makes that more clear than Libby, Montana.
It kind of breaks my heart to talk about it. The mine up there is vermiculite mine. It's about 5-6 miles north.
Vermiculite is a mineral that is used in everything from insulation to fireproofing to potting soil. On its own, it's harmless. The problem was Libby's vermiculite formed mixed in with amphibole asbestos fibers. And the same thing happens with other minerals we mine, including stuff like talc. That's how asbestos ends up in products like the ones we saw at Sean's lab.
And the worst part? The company that owned and operated the mine, W.R. Grace, they knew. They knew the ore contained asbestos, they knew people were getting sick, and they didn't warn the town. In fact, they tried to cover it up for almost 30 years.
They had hundreds of workers in there. And of course, when the miners would go home, they had dust all over their clothes, and their kids and their wives got it and died as well. But the doctors up around Libby, they knew. Boy, did they know.
Besides the lung disease and cancers long associated with asbestos exposure, researchers were also finding rates of some autoimmune diseases were nearly 6 times higher than the national average. And by the time the Libby situation hit the headlines in 1999, reporters documented nearly 200 deaths in a town of fewer than 3,000.
And it can take 20 years for it to go, but pretty soon you have no breath at all and you die of asphyxiation. I could tell talking on the phone by somebody's voice how far along they were toward death, because none of them survived.
Finally, in 2009, the EPA declared a public health emergency in Libby, calling it the worst case of industrial poisoning of a community in U.S. history.
But Libby's just a tip of the iceberg.
Because for decades, W.R. Grace shipped Libby vermiculite around the country, and with it, deadly amphibole asbestos, which ended up in millions of homes as attic insulation. And Grace also made a fireproof spray that was used on the steel frames of high-rise buildings. By 1970, over half of the multi-story buildings erected in the United States used this fireproof spray, including the World Trade Center. But this spray was actually marketed as asbestos-free. According to a later investigation by the New York Times, Grace lobbied regulators to adopt a threshold under which products containing less than 1% of asbestos would not be regulated. Grace argued that the danger of such small amounts had not been proved.
This became known as the 1% rule, or the Grace rule.
That decision didn't just affect the products from Libby's mine, it reshaped how asbestos was detected, regulated, and ignored everywhere.
Okay, when that went down, I knew it. I knew they had asbestos, and so I started calling. I said, how are you going to protect people from that? Because now that stuff's all over the place. You saw the dust clouds, right?
September 11th became the largest real-world test of asbestos detection following a single catastrophic event.
The dust is so thick you can't see.
When the EPA began sampling the dust and analyzing it, they chose a method we used back at the lab called polarized light microscopy, or PLM.
But the PLM has 2 major limitations. First, it struggles to detect asbestos if it's less than 1% by weight in the sample. And second, it can only see the fibers that are roughly longer than about 5 micrometers or wider than about 1/4 of a micrometer.
As a result, the smallest and oftentimes the most dangerous fibers, like the ones pulverized during the collapse of the towers, are difficult to detect using just the PLM.
To reliably find these, you need transmission electron microscopy, or TEM.
Where we top out at about 1,000 times with light microscopy, this tops out at about 1,000,000 times. But what we need to see is just what are the finest fibers that are potentially can go into your lung.
Without having used a TEM, the EPA declared New York's air safe.
Everything we've tested for, which includes asbestos, lead, and VOCs, have been below any level of concern for the general public health.
But some researchers after 9/11 actually did do studies with TEM. They found asbestos levels far above the EPA's own safety thresholds in most of their samples. And the report also warned that because many of these fibers were actually smaller than normal, they were especially dangerous. They posted their results on the American Industrial Hygiene Association website, but within hours, their post disappeared. Less than 24 hours later, the researchers were notified they had been taken off the job and were no longer required at Ground Zero. One former EPA chief investigator later went on CBS saying they believe the agency had deliberately used the wrong testing methods and downplayed the danger.
New York City directly lied about the test results for asbestos in air. When they finally released them, they doctored the results.
We don't know if that's true, but to be clear, PLM is still widely used to detect asbestos because it's faster, it's cheaper, it's easier to deploy. But what we do know is two things. First, the PLM method was not sensitive enough to detect whether there were asbestos fibers in the dust at ground zero. And second, the EPA did have other, more sensitive methods available to them. Whatever the motives, the result was the same. New Yorkers were told that the air was safe when it really wasn't. And as of December 2023, 6,781 of those who have been registered with the World Trade Center Health Program have died either of an illness or a cancer linked just to their time being around ground zero.
But even if the EPA had used the TEM, the answer would still not be simple, because even then, researchers run into a more basic problem. What actually counts as asbestos?
Is there asbestos in the air? Is there asbestos in the soil? Is there asbestos in the water? Is there asbestos in the body? All of those counting rules are based on fibers that are not super long, but they're way longer than the vast majority of, say, libyanthable fibers and the vast majority of fibers that are inhaled. So they're not even counting those. They're not even looking for them. The ways that we are right now telling people whether they're being exposed or not is a lie.
And when longer fibers break, forming these so-called cleavage fragments, they don't count either.
Yeah, there's a whole effort to say, oh yeah, if it's been broken, it's not dangerous. But there are so many papers out there that show that if you put pure cleavage fragments into mice, they get very, very sick.
This really matters when you're in a place like this, and you realize the dust could be considered asbestos contaminated under one definition and perfectly safe under another.
Nobody would have expected to find asbestos here.
To be clear, there were no asbestos mines in Nevada, no industrial sites, no history of asbestos commercial use at all, but geologists Brenda Buck and Rod Metcalf found asbestos spread across approximately 1 million acres outside Las Vegas.
Geologic processes transport these materials, and before the erosion started, they were just in the bedrocks along the mountain front. Now they're in sediments down there, they're in the stream here.
And the problem with the naturally occurring stuff like this is it may be only a small percentage in the rock and even a smaller percentage in the soil, but this stuff gets in the air.
Entire communities might be breathing it in and getting sick without knowing. So Brenda and Rod tried to warn people. Back in late 2012, they compiled all of their findings for a presentation at the Conference of the Geological Society of America. But before the conference even began, the abstract caught the attention of a journalist who reported on the story. And that's when the pushback started. Soon, the state of Nevada sent a cease and desist letter, and officials questioned Brenda and Rod's methods.
So if you go to Las Vegas, you're going to get exposed to asbestos. They didn't want that out there.
Every time I drove into Boulder City, there was an official tailing me within a minute.
The message was clear. Don't look any further.
Well, we did decide to look further, so we drove out into the desert to a popular off-roading spot to test whether there really is asbestos in the dust around Las Vegas.
Okay, I'm strapped into a dune buggy here. I'm going to go down to that basin, and Sean's strapped up some dust collectors with receivers in my breathing zone so we can actually figure out how much asbestos I would be inhaling through the dust that I kick up. You see those donuts, huh?
Yeah, you were ripping it up down there.
Yeah, from a geological point of view, any notes?
It rained today. I thought about that while I was watching. I was like, there might not be much dust, but these are the air samples that were hanging in your breathing zone,
yes,
right?
Yeah.
And I looked at them, and the filters have some tanning on them.
Oh, that's good.
Which means we actually did get some dust. We don't know what's in it yet, but there's something in there.
But the original plan was for us to actually do this at the dry lake bed just outside Boulder City, because this is where people do the majority of their off-roading. You know, they camp, they do photo shoots, even take their wedding photos. Except not on the day that we were there. Okay, we're out here on the dry lake bed, supposedly, in Las Vegas, where on the one day that we're here, the lake has decided not to be dry in any sort of definition. Oh my God. And so what we're gonna go do is suit up, get some samples, and figure out how much asbestos there really is in this stuff. Okay.
We're gonna do a third. Well, let's go out to that island. Okay.
Okay, got the samples. Next step, take them to the lab.
Great to see you guys again. And
yeah, good to see you too. Well, we're here for one thing, I suppose. Like, what kind of results did we get?
Now, the big reveal. Drum roll, please. I did the dune buggy air samples first. Those samples that you had on your left and right shoulders, I didn't find any asbestos fibers.
Okay. Well, I guess that's a bit of a relief. I'm glad we did the demonstration, and I'm kind of glad we didn't find anything, because I'm pretty sure I took my mask off at a few points.
I've been in those shoes, like, we didn't find anything. Oh, but wait a minute. I was breathing that.
Exactly. So what about the samples in the dry lake bed?
Another drum roll.
Okay.
I found amphibole asbestos.
Wow. Okay.
It's there. It is there. I counted up a number of fibers, the area of the filter that I analyzed, and I figured out that we had between 30 and 50 million asbestos structures per gram of mud that we were walking through.
Whoa. Just to think that we pulled off to the side of the road, walked, what, 30 meters, took 3 samples, and all of them had these incredibly high concentrations of asbestos right there. It's not like we had to go up and find it.
Very wet soil was lucky for us because we know there's asbestos in that soil. Now, think about the guys that go taking their Jeep across there when it is a dry lake.
I mean, that was our initial plan, to do the dune buggying there. And I can't like help but think about people drive down that road all the time. They must pull over. They must go down there, like just kick dust and rocks. And
we know they do. We know they do.
And there's no sign to tell you that there's anything wrong with the dry lake. It's not like we, discovered this. This has been available data since
October of 2013 is the actual publication date of naturally occurring asbestos, potential for human exposure in southern Nevada by Brenda Buck et al.
So 13 years we've had this data. It's not like we'd rediscovered anything.
And that's the other thing that's really hard about this science. You need the public to be aware, but you don't want to terrify them. And so how do you find the right way?
This will potentially be seen by tens of millions of people, so is there a message you want to get out?
This is a natural hazard, just like a lot of things in your life. It's really good for people to know whether or not their house is in a flooding zone, right? It's really good to know about earthquake risks. It's really good to know about hurricanes and tornadoes. Well, this is just another natural hazard, and if you have the information, then you can make better decisions to live a healthier life.
One big problem is that asbestos in the real world doesn't line up with how it's regulated. Take this fiber. It comes from a sample of the same blue asbestos from the site outside Las Vegas we visited at the start of the video.
I think we have 2 different phases, at least, of amphibole here, because if it's yellow in this orientation, but also blue in this orientation, in the same fiber bundle, then we have a change in the phase from here to here.
So this one fiber is actually 2 minerals, and that complexity shows up in its structure too. Under the electron microscope, one side could meet the definition of asbestos, the other may not, simply because of its shape. So one single fiber could fall within one of the 6 named and regulated asbestos minerals if you look at one side, but the other would be completely unregulated. Your lungs don't care about these categories, though.
The asbestos fiber, you'll find it everywhere. No ordinary rock. No single rock, indeed, but a group of related minerals with characteristics in common, but in varying degrees.
Most experts will say asbestos isn't a mineralogic or a geologic term, it's a commercial one. But that's symbolics. Why do I say that? Because it's not just a commercial term. We now know that asbestos can kill you. So if we're going to say that, we have to define it based on health effect, and we don't.
So what are we actually doing about it?
The system was so complex, it was so burdensome, that our country hasn't even been able to uphold a ban on asbestos, a known carcinogen that kills as many as 10,000 Americans every year.
Well, in 2016, Congress did try to fix this broken system. They passed an amendment giving the EPA new power to evaluate and restrict dangerous chemicals, including asbestos.
I think it's time to sign the Frank R. Lautenberg Chemical Safety for the 21st Century Act into law.
But then progress stalled again. Under the Trump administration, efforts to strengthen asbestos rules slowed dramatically. Trump had publicly praised asbestos for years.
A lot of people in my industry think asbestos is the greatest fireproofing material ever made.
It wasn't until 2024 that the US finally banned chrysotile asbestos. But this ban doesn't cover the other 5 types of asbestos, and it still allows some manufacturers up to 12 years to phase it out. It doesn't address what to do with asbestos already in schools and homes and other buildings, nor does it fix any of the numerous classification, identification, and detection loopholes, and it doesn't address the asbestos in the environment. On top of that, the EPA is already getting sued again.
There have been tremendous forces from commercial industries to make it sound like it's not as bad as it is, and to find ways to allow them to continue to use the material. This is a sad fact of our decision making in our country and other countries, is that it's driven by money.
But at least the United States are going for some level of moderation. Other countries are not that lucky. In 2019, India imported more than 350,000 tons of asbestos, and it's predicted that in the upcoming decades, 6 million people there might develop asbestos-related diseases. And similar things are happening in many of the other countries in Asia. We've actually found this website where it looks like you can just buy asbestos cloth made in China, but please don't. And all of the asbestos that we've already mined, even after we stopped using it, it's still out there. Asbestos doesn't naturally decay in the environment. So should you be worried? Well, having asbestos in your house doesn't automatically mean that it's dangerous. If you have asbestos in your ceiling and you don't drill into it, you're probably going to be fine. Asbestos is an issue if the particles go airborne. But who knows which house has asbestos, where all of that asbestos is, who's going to take care of it, and how? So a lot of the answers to these questions just don't exist yet. But if you're worried about asbestos exposure for yourself, check out the links that we've put in the description. I think a big part of the problem is that people assume asbestos is a solved issue. And I'll be the first to admit, I fell for that thinking. Here's the ending I wrote for our PFAS video.
We've been here before with leaded gasoline, Freon, and asbestos. And each time, we did the research and made the right decision to phase these chemicals out.
Yeah, I was completely oblivious.
We will look back at our history, and what do we do with tobacco? Everybody was smoking, right? It would be improper for me to not offer an ashtray even if I wasn't a smoker back in the day. And all the scientists working for the big cigarette companies said, why? Tobacco never hurt anybody. But because of the outcry and the recognition that smoking causes disease, everybody knows someone who died because of cigarettes, right? Now you might find out that asbestos-related diseases has touched you in some way. You don't even know yet.
Yeah.
I didn't know my grandfather died because of asbestos, that my father is dying more likely than not, because of asbestos. Did I know that when I started looking at asbestos under a microscope? No. Did I know that when I changed the brakes on the Jeeps that I ran around in? No. Did I know that when I ran around through asbestos-containing dust? No. Now I do.
Pretty much every scientist and journalist we spoke to for this video said the same thing. This is a hard story to get out there. They've faced economic pressure, political pressure, their research got buried, and some people even received death threats for reporting on the story. It is an uncomfortable topic, but I think it's these uncomfortable topics that matter the most, that have the potential to do the most good, yet they are also the ones that are the most uncomfortable to watch. So I really appreciate you for sticking around to the end and facing the truth, making yourself aware, and becoming part of the solution. So perhaps now, more than ever, thank you for watching.
June 6, 1971, the skies above Southern California were clear and calm. It was the kind of day that we pilots really love, with good visibility, smooth air, and with moderate temperatures, low enough to allow the engines to perform near their best. Towards the east of Los Angeles, the mountains were sharply outlined in the late afternoon light, and the LA basin was filled with a familiar haze and smog. This meant that near ground level, the visibility varied between 3 and 6 miles, and a thin veil of scattered clouds sat far above that, at around 23,000 feet or so. Now, high above the suburbs of Los Angeles, 2 aircraft were now moving steadily towards their respective destinations. One of them was a McDonnell Douglas DC-9, who had just taken off from Los Angeles International Airport and was now climbing steadily, with its white fuselage catching the last of the sunlight as it turned northeast. And several miles away, another, very different aircraft was pushing through that same airspace. This was a US Marine Corps F-4 Phantom, a twin-engine fighter jet designed to fly fast, climb quickly, and intercept Soviet bombers. So, even though it was now just being positioned to a base for maintenance, its massive engines still let it cut through the air at nearly twice the speed of an airliner. But the cockpit of the Phantom was also cramped, loud and busy, with its 2 Marine officers focused on just getting their ailing aircraft home. And neither of these 2 aircraft knew that the other existed, but within minutes that would tragically change. Anyway, for the crew of Hugh Air West Flight 706, the evening had begun like these type of duties normally did. The flight was scheduled to operate from Los Angeles over to Seattle, with intermediate stops planned in Salt Lake City, Utah, Boise and Lewiston, Idaho, and Pasco and Yakima, Washington. This was a familiar route for the involved crew, which they flew quite regularly, and there was nothing about it that demanded special attention, especially not on a nice day like this. The aircraft they were using on this evening was a McDonnell Douglas DC-9, registered as November 9345, and it was literally built for short-haul hops like this one. Back in 1971, it represented the pinnacle of the modern jet age. Reliable, efficient, trusted, and this particular aircraft was almost brand new, having been delivered to Air West Airlines just a year earlier. Now, the airline in itself had recently gone through some changes, at least in its name. Just a few years earlier, Air West had been purchased by the reclusive billionaire Howard Hughes, a man whose life had already become inseparable from aviation lore at that point. Hughes had built his fortune partially on aircraft manufacturing, record-setting flights, and an obsessive belief in technical excellence. So when he acquired the airline in 1968, it was rebranded as Hughes Air West, complete with a new image, new uniforms, and a new livery that would soon become unmistakable across the western United States. But despite Hughes' involvement, this was not a vanity project or a risky experiment. No, Hughes Air West operated as a conventional, well-run regional carrier, flying modern aircraft on tightly scheduled routes throughout the western United States. So critically, nothing about Hughes Air West operations, maintenance or crew training would play any role in what was soon about to happen. The pilots in charge of this flight had been with the company since long before Howard Hughes had put his name on it, and were both very experienced. The captain was 50 years old and had logged about 15,500 total hours, with more than 2,500 on the DC-9. And he was going to act as pilot flying for the first leg of this flight, was his 49-year-old first officer, who had accumulated 17,100 total hours and about 300 on the DC-9, would be pilot monitoring. Behind them, they were joined by 3 cabin crew and 44 passengers, making the total head count for the first flight 49. And at time 1802 local, Flight 706 lined up with the runway at Los Angeles International Airport and started accelerating. This design philosophy worked remarkably well in combat, but it also meant that the Phantom could continue flying in conditions that would have grounded any commercial airliner, basically relying on doctrine, training and risk acceptance that made sense in a military context, but carried very different consequences if the aircraft would leave controlled military airspace and enter the civilian system, which is worth keeping in mind. But the Phantom was really good at what it did. In fact, there are still some militaries in the world using it today with just some upgraded radars and sensors. But on June the 6th, 1971, this particular Phantom was not in a good shape. 2 days before, on June the 4th, the aircraft had departed from its home base, the Marine Corps Air Station El Toro, just south of Los Angeles, for a routine 2-aircraft training mission. And the plan had been for a long cross-country flight north to McCord Air Force Base in Washington State, routing via McClellan Air Force Base in Sacramento on the outbound leg, and with a return flight south through Mountain Home, Idaho. Now, the crew in the Phantom consisted of 2 people, a pilot and a radar intercept officer, where the radar intercept officer, or RIO, sat in the rear cockpit and managed the aircraft's radar, navigation systems, radios and weapons systems, and the pilot sat in the forward seat. During combat, the RIO was responsible for detecting and tracking other aircraft, operating the sensors, guiding intercepts and maintaining situational awareness, whilst the pilot was just supposed to be focused on flying the jet. So the F-4 had been designed from the outset to be flown by a 2-person crew, precisely because the workload was too great for any one person alone. The pilot was at this point 27 years old and had logged 840 hours of total time, with 170 of those being on the F-4. And the radar intercept officer was 24 years old with 195 hours of flight time and 89 of those on the type. From a civilian aviation perspective, those numbers obviously look quite low, and an airline captain back in 1971 would typically have thousands of hours before being trusted with a jetliner full of passengers, and even a newly hired first officer would have arrived with several hundred hours of flight time. So, by comparison, an F-4 crew with around 1,000 of total hours between them might have seemed alarmingly inexperienced. And while that might be true, you have to remember that in the early 1970s, the United States Marine Corps was still in the final years of the Vietnam War, and the demand for combat-ready aircrew was therefore intense. Fighter pilots and radar intercept officers were being trained quickly, deliberately, and with a focus on specific mission profiles rather than broad accumulation of flight hours. So, within that context, these experience levels were not that unusual. Anyway, shortly after the 2 F-4s took off from El Toro, technical problems had begun to stack up. First, the transponders in both planes, which allowed civilian radar systems to positively identify and track them, failed shortly after takeoff. But despite that, the mission was still allowed to continue north under control of air traffic control, receiving vectors to keep them safe and away from other traffic using raw radar and position reports. So both planes therefore initially continued on to McCord Air Force Base in Washington, where they soon landed and then spent the night. On the next day, June 5th, the 2 aircraft then departed again, but when Phantom 458 was on final approach to its next stop at Mountain Home Air Force Base in Idaho, its radio also failed. After landing, when the maintenance crews inspected the aircraft, they found a growing list of issues with it. So at that point, the higher ranking officer and his Rio in the other F4 just decided to head back to El Toro alone, leaving Phantom 458 to see if the engineers could try and fix any of its issues. But it soon turned out that for the most part, they couldn't. The radio problem was traced down to a blown fuse and corrected, but the transponder required specialized knowledge and personnel that Mountain Home just didn't have, so it remained inoperative. And in addition to that, the Phantom's nose radar was also degraded and largely unreliable. Now, this system was a complex multi-mode fire control radar designed primarily for long-range intercepts, air-to-air combat and radar-based navigation. But Phantom 458's radar performance was now so degraded that it couldn't be relied upon for air-to-air detection at all. And to add further insult to injury, the aircraft's oxygen system was also leaking. And while the leak could be confirmed by maintenance crews, it couldn't be repaired, which effectively limited how high the aircraft would be allowed to operate, constraining the crew to lower altitudes until it could be fixed. So with no immediate way to fully fix everything, the crew made the decision to just move on to the next step of the mission. Flying a VFR, or Visual Flight Rules, visual-only flight plan to Fallon Air Station in Nevada, where they would then overnight and refuel in order to stay within duty hours. Said and done, the crew saddled up and flew their aircraft down to Nevada, and on the following day, June 6th, they finally started preparing for the last leg home. At the base, the maintenance crews had made a final attempt to fix some of the systems, but without any real success, determining that only 458's home base in El Toro had the necessary capability to fix all of these issues. So before the crew departed Fallon, the pilot contacted his squadron duty officer and informed him of the technical status of his aircraft, and the duty officer told him to just take the plane back to El Toro at low altitude. The oxygen leak made it impossible to operate at the altitude that they would normally fly, and because the aircraft transponder was also inoperative, they couldn't legally operate under instrument flight rules in busy civilian airspace. So the only solution was to fly the jet home visually, at low altitude, beneath the layers of airspace controlled by civilian air traffic controllers, like a super-fast Cessna of sorts. And this also meant that the pilot and radar intercept officer now started planning this Visual Flight Rules route back to Southern California. And to understand why this made sense, it helps to understand a little bit more about how this airspace worked back in 1971. You see, at the time, most civilian jet traffic operated inside what was known as the Area of Positive Control, which included everything at flight level 240, or 24,000 feet, and above. Inside that airspace, air traffic controllers were responsible for keeping aircraft separated using radar and procedural spacing, and all aircraft operating there were required to have both functioning radios and transponders, and to fly under instrument flight rules. But below this, the rules were very different. Aircraft flying visually under Visual Flight Rules, or VFR, were largely responsible for their own separation. Pilots could request traffic advisories and avoidance vectors from air traffic control, but they were not guaranteed it. VFR traffic was also obviously always expected to look outside and avoid other traffic. That rule existed everywhere and actually still does today. So what made flights outside the area of positive control different was not the presence of see and avoid, but the absence of anything else improving separation. Basically, this was the equivalent of flight in uncontrolled G airspace today. On top of that, radar coverage was often incomplete, and transponders were not universally required in these levels, so that basically put all of the responsibility of separation in the hands of the pilots, a fact that had already proved to be very flawed. You see, mid-air collisions had been a reoccurring problem throughout the 1950s and 60s, particularly in busy terminal areas and along common climb and descent paths. And all the investigations basically showed the same pattern. Aircraft operating legally in clear weather with crews scanning for traffic, yet still colliding because circumstances just rendered see and avoid insufficient. But this risk had basically been accepted anyway, because the infrastructure to fully avoid it just didn't really exist yet. And making that risk even worse was also the way commercial traffic was handled back in 1971. You see, traffic operated under instrument flight rules was not guaranteed continuous positive control all the way from takeoff up to cruise and down again. Instead, departing aircraft often climbed out of an airport terminal control area, passing through an intermediate layer of airspace where radar coverage and separation responsibilities were limited. And then, only later, they entered the area of positive control at higher altitude. So in that gap, IFR traffic could briefly find itself operating in airspace shared with traffic flying under visual flight rules, despite climbing along predictable, high-density jet routes. Today, we have terminal control areas specifically designed to keep departing and arriving jets under continuous positive control. And we also have consolidated tray cone structures with layered radar coverage, mandatory transponders and positive separation, extending much closer to the ground, specifically for this purpose. Anyway, as the crew of Phantom 458 was preparing to depart from Fallon in the morning, they were told that they would be delayed by several hours due to an air show closing El Toro's airspace that afternoon. So the crew now decided to postpone their departure, and they therefore finally lifted off at time 1716, initially climbing to 6,000 feet to clear some terrain and clouds over the mountains, but they then descended down again, flying less than 1,000 feet above the ground when the valleys flattened out into the high desert of the American Southwest. Now the Phantom was very fast at that low altitude, a lot faster than most civilian aircraft operating below controlled airspace. And that speed fundamentally changed the way the crew had to manage their workload. You see, at several hundred knots, terrain, landmarks and airspace boundaries rushed past in seconds, not minutes. So navigation errors closed quickly, weather and haze left less time to react, and any traffic that would appear ahead of them would do so with very little warning. But even though that was the case, in the rear of the cockpit, the radar intercept officer was now not actively searching for other aircraft. Instead, he was conducting a radar mapping exercise, operating the Phantom's nose radar in a ground mapping mode. Now that mode was intended to display terrain features for navigation and training, not to detect airborne targets. And investigators later noted that if he was going to attempt a radar exercise at all during this portion of the flight, then he should have set the radar into search mode instead. Because even when degraded, the radar would have then offered some insight into traffic that was ahead of them instead of nothing at all. But since that mode was now never set, the radar provided no meaningful awareness of traffic ahead, and the operator's attention was instead directed downwards, towards a display that was never even intended to serve as a collision avoidance aid, particularly in busy civilian airspace. Meanwhile, the pilot up in the front scanned outside constantly, watching for terrain and traffic, knowing that anything he saw would appear suddenly and without warning. At over 400 knots, which they were now cruising at, compression of time really mattered, because visual scanning for us pilots is not just about looking outside, it's about having enough time to detect an object, recognize it as a threat, assess its motion, and then decide how to avoid it. At high speed, each one of those steps obviously had to happen much, much faster. And this is one of the reasons that we have a mandatory speed restriction of 250 knots when flying below 10,000 feet in most of the world today. Anyway, as the Phantom approached Bakersfield, the crew checked in with ATC to get the weather at El Toro. Conditions ahead looked workable, but the Los Angeles basin was very busy with traffic, as it always was. So rather than trying to thread their way directly over the city, the crew now made another decision that seemed prudent at the time. Instead of approaching El Toro directly from the north, they would instead swing east towards Palmdale, skirting the worst of the traffic before turning south again towards the base. But Southern California is not a forgiving airspace. The terrain rises quickly as the desert gives way to steep foothills and rugged mountains, and on top of that, as Phantom 458 moved east of Bakersfield and towards the San Gabriel Range, the visibility now started to deteriorate. The haze got worse and worse, washing out contrast and softening the landscape until even familiar landmarks were hard to distinguish. and flying as low as they did now started to feel increasingly uncomfortable to the pilot. So to maintain visual sight of the terrain and avoid flying blind into rising ground, the pilot now began to climb. He spooled the Phantom's engines up and then pitched sharply upwards, sending the aircraft shooting up towards a new target altitude of 15,500 feet. Up there, he was still operating fully within the rules, since they hadn't entered the area of positive control yet, but this also meant that their flight path would end up directly in the corridor used by eastbound jet traffic departing the Los Angeles area towards the northeast. So, as Hughes Air West Flight 706 was now climbing eastbound along one of the most heavily used departure corridors in the country, it was also about to pass through altitudes where controller authority was not yet absolute. And at that same time, Phantom 458 was flying VFR, legally, outside controlled airspace, and had now entered that same vertical slice of airspace. This meant that both of these aircraft were operating perfectly within the existing rules, but with no functioning control system to keep them apart. As the Phantom was climbing up through the haze, on board Flight 706, the pilots were still also climbing smoothly away from the city. At time 1806, they were then handed over to Los Angeles Center, transitioning out of the terminal area and into the broader airspace system. 3 minutes later, as they climbed through 12,000 feet, the crew were instructed to turn left onto a heading of 040 degrees and then to proceed direct towards a point called Daggett. So the first officer read back, turn left to 040, proceed toward Daggett. And that would be the last transmission this crew would ever make. At that moment, the DC-9 and the Phantom weren't just unaware of each other's presence, they were also separated by radio frequencies. You see, as they climbed out of LAX, Flight 706 was in continuous contact with Los Angeles Center, but Phantom 458 was not part of that conversation because as a VFR plane in VFR airspace, it didn't have any requirement to talk to air traffic control at all. Now, if the sector controller had seen the Phantom as a distinctive radar target, he could have still issued a traffic advisory to Hughes Air West Flight 706 describing the bearing and direction of the return, but that never happened. You see, without a functioning transponder used for what we call secondary radar, the F4 would only appear as a primary radar return, which is just a physical reflection of the radar beam bouncing off the aircraft itself. That would offer no altitude, no identity, and often not even a certainty that it was an aircraft at all. Investigators later found that the 458's primary radar return would have been faint and intermittent at best, because the Phantom had a weak radar profile by design, and it was also moving very fast with a temperature inversion between the antenna and the aircraft, which was further interfering with the radar. So this meant that on some radar sweeps, the Phantom didn't appear at all, and on others, it likely just flickered briefly, almost indistinguishable from the background radar noise on the screen. And since there was no altitude information, no identification, or anything else telling the controllers that what they saw was actually an aircraft, none of the 4 controllers that were looking at the screen, some of whom were also under training on that day, recognized the threat. On top of that, since the Phantom wasn't required to inform air traffic control of its location, and in fact had never contacted the center at all, the controller couldn't issue any instruction or warnings to its pilot either. Now, the Phantom could have called Los Angeles Center at any time to request radar monitoring or traffic advisories, but that was discretionary, not required, and this crew, for whatever reason, therefore never did it. So it was now up to these 2 aircraft to see and avoid each other, and as the flight path converged, the angles from which they did also didn't help. Investigators would later note that there was nothing blocking the pilot's view here, so under ideal conditions, the 2 aircraft should have been able to see each other, at least theoretically, for about 35 seconds or so. But being visible doesn't necessarily mean detectable. You see, in this case, there were several factors that made it less likely that these 2 crews would be able to see each other. And the biggest of those was the fact that they were now approaching each other on what we call constant bearings. That's when two aircraft are on a collision course, but due to their relative positions, their appearance in the windscreen will change very little until the very last seconds. And without any sideways movement to draw the eye, there's also nothing instinctive to trigger our attention. The threat just slowly grows bigger and bigger. Now, it is easy to assume in hindsight that clear weather should have made the other aircraft easier to see. After all, the sky over Southern California that evening was clear and the visibility was good, so on paper the conditions seemed ideal for sea and the void. But again, it just isn't that simple. Because clear skies meant that there also were no clouds behind the two aircraft that could provide some contrast, nor any other background features that would help the pilots to detect each other's relative movement. So the DC-9's white fuselage likely blended into the sky behind, and the Phantom's light paint also blended into the terrain and haze. But having said that, the pilot in Phantom 458 had been trained extensively in lookout doctrine and visual scanning techniques during his initial flight school. And both the pilot and radar intercept officer had then received additional instruction, focused on scan techniques used during tactical intercepts and pursuit after they had joined their squadron. So scan discipline was reinforced routinely in their normal duties. On the other hand, the crew of Flight 706 had never received any recurrent training on visual scanning, which was something that the investigators later made sure to call out in their report. Now, all pilots do scan for traffic, but it is important to remember that visual scanning is not something that commercial pilots do continuously all the time. That's something that's instead shared with every other task that we have in the cockpit. Monitoring instruments, tracking altitude and heading, managing navigation and listening to radios, and of course also planning the next phase of the flight. So in that type of environment, pilots doesn't just stare fixedly ahead, which means that an object that remains nearly stationary in the forward field of view likely wouldn't get any attention until it was too late. At this point, the crew of Phantom 458 was also working in a relatively high workload, with the pilot hand-flying the aircraft, managing altitude and attitude in deteriorating visibility, while navigating complex terrain and monitoring a jet with multiple degraded systems. And in the rear, the radar intercept officer was still conducting that exercise I mentioned before, using his degraded radar set in a mode that offered them little help with looking for traffic. And that also required him to keep his head down and to lean forward to try and use the radar display while it was in its stowed position. So at time 1811, with Flight 706 still in a climb towards their cruise altitude and Phantom 458 now in level flight, the two crews still had no idea that they were now on a direct collision course. At a combined speed of well over 600 knots, the distance between the two aircraft was now reducing rapidly, even though neither crew perceived that change directly. In the front of Phantom 458, the pilot just continued scanning visually as best as he could, but the Phantom was designed for sprints at more than twice the speed of sound, and so it was fitted with a thick cockpit glass that needed reinforcements. And these gave it very poor visibility in the front and almost none to the back. So in order to help alleviate this fact, pilots were trained to move the aircraft around to help clear their blind spots. And in line with that training, a few moments after he had leveled off, the pilot now rolled the Phantom into a brief controlled aileron roll. This was likely not, as many bystanders would later tell investigators, acrobatics or showing off. Instead, it was likely a scanning maneuver, a quick sweep above and below the nose in order to check the blind spots that a straight-ahead view would easily miss. That roll lasted only a few seconds, and the sky appeared clear, so the Phantom then just rolled wings level again and continued flying straight ahead. And there, ahead of them and just below to the right of the nose, was Hugh Air West Flight 706. 1 minute and 20 seconds passed, while the radar operator continued to look at his radar scope to map the terrain below them. And it was only somewhere between 3 and 10 seconds before the collision that he finally lifted his head. In his peripheral vision, he now noticed a sudden change. A flash of white slightly below on the head, where there previously had only been sky. Now, this wasn't a shape that he had time to study or identify, it was just there. Immediately, he now shouted out a warning to his colleague, and almost at the same instant, the pilot reacted. He snapped the Phantom into an evasive roll, forcing the nose down and to the left hard, but it was too late. At that speed, there just wasn't any room left to maneuver. So at the time, 18, 11 and 20 seconds, the two planes collided with a sickening sound of impact and twisted metal. For the pilots on board Hugh Air West Flight 706, there was no warning, and they likely never knew what hit them. The Phantom struck the DC-9 while banking left and down, and the ensuing collision ended up being absolutely devastating. The fighter's right wing sliced through the lower forward fuselage of the airliner, tearing through the structure as far back as to the 10th window row, and almost simultaneously, the Phantom's vertical stabilizer cut upward through the cockpit, passing directly beneath the windscreen. This meant that all primary flight controls on the DC-9 were immediately severed, and the forward fuselage lost its integrity in an instant, breaking apart with what was left of the cockpit and forward galley falling away. Witnesses on the ground later described what looked like an explosion in the sky and seeing the DC-9 suddenly pitch up and then roll left, with pieces of the aircraft separating almost immediately, leaving a trail of debris as it began tumbling downwards. On the radar scopes of Los Angeles Center, the target that had been Flight 706 soon no longer made any sense. Its clean, steady track was gone, replaced by returns that flickered and broke up, showing pieces that no longer correlated to a single aircraft. At that moment, the pieces of the DC-9 were already in a steep, uncontrolled descent, with aerodynamic forces continuing to tear at what remained of the airframe, causing further structural failures. But for the crew of Phantom 458, the collision had actually been survivable. The F-4 had struck the DC-9 at a speed of 420 knots, and the violence of that collision had obviously critically damaged the aircraft. The nose of the Phantom was torn apart, the right wing was smashed and the tail was ripped free, which also destabilized the plane, causing it to yaw and roll as debris flew past the cockpit. Inside, the pilot and radar intercept officers suddenly found themselves fighting a machine that was no longer controllable. But the Phantom had been designed with an ejection system, meant to give its crews a last chance when everything else had failed. And in these final seconds, that system now became the only option left, but also the latest system to fail. The radar intercept officer in the rear seat initiated his ejection first, and that single action set off a chain of events that finally sealed the outcome. You see, the Phantom's escape system relied on a complex, tightly timed chain of events taking place over the course of milliseconds. When initiated, explosive charges were supposed to jettison the canopies away, and only once the canopies were clear would the electrical circuit allow the firing of the rocket motors inside of the ejection seats. Now, the canopy had to be completely clear of the plane, so to enforce that sequence, the system included a circuit breaker, which physically prevented the seat from firing if the canopy was still in place. In theory, this ensured safe operation, but in this case, when the radar intercept officer ejected first, it disrupted the electrical circuit that enabled the pilot's canopy to be released. So with his canopy still in place, the pilot's ejection seat now couldn't fire, and the pilot was left trapped inside the burning aircraft. Now, this wasn't a freak coincidence, nor an unknown failure. In fact, this was a known design flaw in the F-4 Bravo's ejector seat and canopy assembly, which made it likely, though not guaranteed, that if the radar intercept officer ejected first, the pilot might not be able to eject at all. The modification to correct this flaw already existed. The Navy and the Marine Corps had scheduled its aircraft to receive an upgraded system that removed this vulnerability, and Phantom 458 was in line to receive that modification in the following month. But on June 6, 1971, it was still flying with its original design, sealing the fate of its pilot. After a brief plunge towards the Earth, Phantom 458 soon struck ground at the southern edge of the San Gabriel Mountains, with the pilot still trapped inside. And only about a mile away, at almost the same time, the DC-9 also hit the mountainside, killing all 49 passengers and crew on board. The radar intercept officer from the Phantom managed to parachute down into the San Gabriel Valley, making him the accident's only survivor. In the days that followed, investigators began rebuilding the accident from fragments like ATC recordings, radar plots and witness statements, including the one from the Phantom's radar intercept officer, as well as the physical evidence scattered across the San Gabriel Mountains. The post-crash fire had been intense enough to completely destroy the DC-9's cockpit voice recorder, while its flight data recorder captured only a limited set of parameters, and Phantom 458 carried no recorders at all. This obviously forced the investigators to reconstruct the final moments largely from external evidence rather than from the aircraft themselves. And the picture that soon emerged was deeply uncomfortable, since it didn't seem to hinge on a single mistake. Flight 706 had been flying a normal, cleared IFR departure. The Phantom had been operating VFR with a failed transponder, intermittent radio capability, and a plan that depended almost entirely on see and avoid through one of the busiest airspaces in the country. And this obviously quickly led to some sweeping changes. In the civilian world, the accident forced regulators to confront a problem that had been hiding in plain sight all along. There was an uncontrolled overlap between high-speed jet departure corridors and uncontrolled VFR traffic. So one of the FAA's most immediate responses was the development of VFR terminal area charts for 22 major metropolitan regions. This was done to explicitly depict the IFR arrival and departure corridors used by airliners so that VFR pilots could see on a chart where the jet traffic would be concentrated and therefore plan to avoid those routes. In a larger context, the crash added momentum to a broader restructuring of the US airspace with the goal of ensuring that IFR aircraft remained in positively controlled airspace continuously from shortly after takeoff until landing. That effort drove the expansion of terminal control areas and higher altitude positive control airspaces, gradually closing those dangerous uncontrolled gaps. But changes also occurred on the military side. The ejection seat and canopy sequencing used on the F-4 was formally recognized as a design deficiency, and the logic was revised so that one crew member's ejection could no longer prevent the other from escaping. And more importantly, training guidance was changed to restrict where military aircraft could operate at high speed and altitude in congested airspace, particularly above 10,000 feet and 250 knots. And air crews were explicitly trained to request radar monitoring and traffic advisories from civilian and air traffic controllers when operating under visual flight rules. So with all of those changes in mind, it would be nice to say that this collision belongs to a different era in aviation, one with primitive radar, loose rules and fewer safeguards, but the truth is sadly far more complex than that. Certainly, technology and airplanes have changed, but the airspace has also become far more congested in the 54 years since this collision happened. And unfortunately, the underlying problems that caused it have not yet been fully solved. Not because they can't be, but because the will to do so does not seem to exist among the people that have the ability to fix it. We probably saw that most starkly in the January 2025 Washington DC mid-air collision, and then again recently with the near collision of an Air Force tanker and a JetBlue flight which was eerily similar to this accident. Each one is a reminder that see and avoid is still being asked to carry far more weight than human vision can reliably bear at jet speeds, and it seems like the US military is permitted to operate with far less oversight than civilian air traffic does, all while still sharing the same airspace as we do. Now we are still waiting for the final report of the January mid-air collision in Washington DC, but when it comes, I will be covering it thoroughly. And I wouldn't be surprised if some very disturbing parallels to this accident will be found there as well. My name is Petter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentor Pilot. You can support the work that we do by going to patreon.com/join/mentorpilot and sign up, or by supporting our sponsor. Have an absolutely fantastic day wherever you are, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye. Ditching a passenger jet on the open ocean, miles away from land, is something that very few pilots have ever attempted. To do that, we would have to deal with huge waves, long rescue times, possible sharks, and very, very cold water. So even if the ditching would be successful, survival would be far from guaranteed. But it has actually happened a few times in history, and one of those took place in the spring of 1970 with the obscure US charter company Overseas National Airways. ONA, as it was known, was a carrier specializing in military cargo contracts, charters, as well as lease agreements with other airlines. And back in 1970, they operated a fleet consisting of Douglas DC-8s, DC-9s, as well as several Lockheed Electras. During the year before, ONA had been approached with a lease agreement proposal from ALM, Antillean Airlines, which at that time was a subsidiary of Dutch KLM and the flag carrier of the Netherlands Antilles. ALM operated a route network connecting various Dutch-controlled islands in the Caribbean, including Aruba, Curaçao and St. Martin, but they were now also looking to expand by adding a direct flight between St. Martin and New York City, using a leased ONA aircraft. St. Martin is a small Caribbean island located about 270 kilometers east of Puerto Rico, which is notable for being split almost 50-50 between France and the Netherlands. The island is served by Princess Juliana International Airport, located on the Dutch side of the island, and you might already know about it thanks to viral videos of people trying to stand up against jet blasts on Maho Beach, which is not something I recommend, by the way. Today, Princess Juliana Airport can handle aircraft as big as Boeing 747s, but back in 1970 the airport was much less developed and the runway was only 5,249 feet long with water at both ends. That made it too short for ONA's 4-engine DC-8s, but ONA's CEO managed to convince ALM that the flights to New York could still be operated using their 2-engine DC-9s. Now, using a DC-9 on this route was technically possible, but also quite difficult in practice. You see, while a DC-9 could easily land on St. Martin's short runway, most models didn't have enough range to fly non-stop between there and New York unless they were very lightly loaded. The only DC-9 variant in ONA's fleet that could make that journey non-stop with a reasonable was the company's only DC-9-33, which had just enough extra range to meet the legal requirements. So, said and done, ONA and ALM agreed to initiate this service using that aircraft under a contract known as a damp lease, where ONA, which was a big problem for both ONA and ALM, since they had already started advertising the service. The FAA proposed that the flights should be routed via the Bahamas to stay closer to land, but this would also make the trip much longer, forcing the flights to stop for fuel along the way. And if they did that, ONA would lose money on the flights, and they were already losing money overall, so that was a non-starter for them. But just days before the flights were supposed to start, McDonnell Douglas came to ONA's rescue by publishing a new single-engine descent procedure that extended the 1-hour range just enough to cover the gap in the original proposed routing. This meant that the FAA finally approved these non-stop flights, but that didn't solve all of the problems. You see, the DC-933 only had enough range to make that trip non-stop if conditions were perfect. So if there were any en route delays due to weather or traffic, the contract stipulated that the flights could do a fuel stop on the island of Bermuda. So the plan became to then fly from New York generally towards Bermuda. Then before crossing the island, the pilots would evaluate whether they could reach St. Martin with the required fuel margin. And if they could, well, then they could just proceed directly towards the destination without the fuel stop. This was a little bit convoluted, but by some miracle, the New York to St. Martin route began as scheduled in January of 1970, but it didn't take long before the FAA threatened to ground the flights again, this time due to a dispute over the seating in the DC-9's cockpit. You see, back in the early days of transoceanic flights, navigators were employed to calculate the aircraft's course while out of range of ground-based navigational aids over the ocean. And by 1970, navigators were rapidly becoming obsolete. But ONA still had a contract with the Navigators Union lasting until 1971. And under that contract, any flight that would fly out of range of ground-based navigational aids had to have a navigator on board. And a very brief stretch of this route met those criteria, so ONA was obliged to supply a qualified navigator. Now, ONA had already arranged for the pilots to traverse that small gap using brand new Lorraine C long-range navigational equipment, so there was actually nothing for that navigator to do, but still, they had to be there. The DC-9 was obviously designed to only have a cockpit crew of 2. Not 3, so the navigator had to sit in the tiny, uncomfortable jump seat for the 3.5-hour flight down and then back up again from St. Martin. And shortly after the service began,
You're watching The Legal Breakdown. Glenn, we have a grim update as far as the Epstein files are concerned, and it directly implicates Donald Trump. There has been more and more evidence from the Epstein files emerging that implicate Trump specifically with some young girls. I'm not going to share any specifics because it's too graphic to share here. It's readily available on Twitter for folks who are interested in doing a deeper dive into this stuff. But suffice it to say that the stories that were put forward and submitted to law enforcement on behalf of these young girls are as gruesome and vile as it gets, which raises the question about Pam Bondi's involvement in all of this, because just a week ago, Pam Bondi testified in front of the Oversight Committee, and she said this.
There is no evidence that Donald Trump has committed a crime. Everyone knows that. This has been the most transparent presidency.
So that was Pam Bondi saying, and I quote, "There is no evidence that Donald Trump has committed a crime." But doesn't that negate the fact that there is evidence contained within the Epstein files, credibility notwithstanding, because I don't know whether they've gone into the credibility of that evidence, but there does exist evidence that Donald Trump has done something wrong or committed a crime. And so can you speak to that statement that was put forward by Pam Bondi in light of this new evidence that's surfacing right now from the Epstein files?
Yeah, Brian, a couple of things are at play here. First of all, if a witness or an alleged victim orally communicates to the FBI or any law enforcement agency, "I was assaulted," that's evidence of a potential crime. Now, it has to be investigated. It has to be either corroborated or contradicted, or if neither of those two things can be accomplished by law enforcement, it may just sit in FBI or law enforcement files, sort of pending further investigative leads that can be pursued. But the reality is, if you're reading that in a police file, it's evidence. It may not be credible evidence at the end of the day. It may be credible evidence at the end of the day, but it is clearly evidence contained in the file. So I have to tell you, Brian, when I saw the Attorney General of the United States, Pam Bondi, say there is no evidence that Donald Trump committed any crime, and then we started to see reports from people who are doing deep dives into the, millions of Epstein documents, and things began to emerge that seemed to implicate or at least reference some of the things Donald Trump had done. I agree with a number of lawmakers that I have heard say Pam Bondi lied in her testimony before the House Judiciary Committee. It would have been very different if she had said, for example, there is no credible evidence in the Epstein files that Donald Trump engaged in any criminal activity. You know what? That word would have done some real heavy lifting in protecting her against an allegation that she lied to Congress. Now, she would have to back it up with, for example, we saw the references to Donald Trump's conduct in there. We drilled down, we investigated, we interviewed the witnesses and the victims, and we deemed it to be not credible at the end of the day. Then if she had said, there's no credible evidence in the Epstein files that Donald Trump engaged in any crimes or misconduct, that might be a completely different story. That's not what she said. And that's why I think you are hearing some lawmakers, and I agree with those lawmakers. It appears that Bondi committed the crime of making a false statement to Congress. It's kind of similar to perjury, but when somebody lies to Congress, whether under oath or not, it's what we call a 1001 statement. Under 18 United States Code, Section 1001, false statements to Congress. Each false statement you make to Congress carries with it up to 5 years in prison. And, you know, based on this old prosecutor's assessment of her testimony and what we are learning, what's emerging from the Epstein files, it seems like, you know, at some point, she's going to have to be investigated once the rule of law comes back into the light of day for the potential crimes she committed before Congress.
Well, it's clear that the DOJ under Pam Bondi is not going to investigate Pam Bondi. I mean, hell, the whole point of this DOJ is that they don't investigate or prosecute anybody aligned with their administration. But I guess the question remains, what is the statute of limitations for something like this? And is it something that a subsequent administration would be able to pick up?
Yeah, a 1001 violation, false statement to Congress, carries a 5-year statute of limitations. So assuming the next presidential election goes to the Democrats, then you're going to have the rule of law becoming a thing again, importantly, in the Department of Justice itself. And the one thing I have been beating the drum about, Brian, as have you, is, you know, we tried the lack of accountability route last time when Donald Trump left office. And, you know, it feels to me like Merrick Garland sort of de facto was of the belief that, again, we have to just put this long national nightmare behind us with no accountability for any of the crimes of Trump and company. Eventually, when push came to shove, he appointed Jack Smith. Too little, too late, notwithstanding Jack Smith's best efforts. But, you know, we have been fooled before, right? Gerald Ford said we were going to put the long national nightmare behind us by deciding to pardon Richard Nixon and, you know, make sure there was no accountability at all for the crimes that he committed in a very real sense against the American people. I would assert that, in fact, in practice, we tried that again last time Donald Trump left power. And you know what? If we do it a third time, once the Democrats come back into power, if we again decide for whatever reason to decline to hold Trump and company accountable for their crimes, as far as I'm concerned, we don't keep our republic, and frankly, I don't think we deserve to keep our republic. So that's why, you know, I will remain, you know, focused like a laser beam on accountability for the crimes being perpetrated against the American people by Trump and anybody else that an investigation shows committed crimes. They need to be held accountable.
And I'm so glad you said that. And I would use this opportunity then to tell folks who aren't yet subscribed to both of these channels, both my channel and Glenn's channel, if you think that our commentary is important and meets the urgency of this moment, the best way to show some support for our work is to subscribe to our channels. It's 100% free, but it's a great way to support us and independent media, so those links are in the post description of this video. If you're not yet subscribed, please go ahead and subscribe. Glenn, so we've spoken about the prospect of Pam Bondi having committed the crime of lying to Congress, basically lying under oath. But you and I have also spoken about another crime that she and other officials at the DOJ have possibly committed, and that is to act as an accessory after the fact. So can you speak about that a little bit? Because your theory of this case has actually been validated by a number of state attorneys general that I've spoken with after the fact.
Yeah, you know, if we learned anything going back to the Watergate era, if the crime doesn't get you, the cover-up will, because it really was the cover-up that brought Richard Nixon and his criminal associates down. So now we have the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, the Deputy Attorney General, Todd Blanche, and potentially others engaged in what sure looks like a cover-up. We would need to drill down, we would need to investigate, but we know that there are improper redactions being made to the Epstein files in violation of federal law, the Epstein Files Transparency Act. And we know some of the potential wrongdoers, their identity is being hidden from the public in violation of federal law. If that is not accessory after the fact, helping people avoid accountability for their crimes, I don't know what is. You know, to be an accessory after the fact, all it takes is you have to know a crime has been committed in violation of the laws of the United States, and you have to do anything that would actually help the perpetrator avoid detection, apprehension, trial, or punishment. You know, by wrongfully and unlawfully concealing the names of people who seem to have been involved in criminal conduct contained in the Epstein files, it's really no different than Pam Bondi just hiding these people out in their basement to make sure, that they're not detected, that they're not tried, that they're not punished, that they're not held accountable for their crimes. So the elements, the principles of the crime accessory after the fact seem to be there in spades. And again, we have to wait for the rule of law to come back into the light of day, you know, because we know Pam Bondi and Todd Blanche are not going to hold themselves accountable, and they're sure as heck not going to do anything that could, you know, visit Donald Trump in a negative way.
Glenn, do you have faith that our judicial system can handle this? And I ask as somebody who did hundreds of episodes with you during the, 2020 to 2024 period where Trump was being prosecuted in 4 legitimate different cases, was indicted in these cases, and none of them were able to be seen through until the end. And so, look, I know that a lot of people watching this right now are gonna say, yeah, sure, they can be held accountable, but what is there to show that we actually have the stomach to hold powerful people to account in this country, given everything that we've seen? And so, what would your response be to that criticism?
Yeah, Brian, it's a fair question, and it's an important question. Do I think the judiciary is up to the task of holding, in particular, the ruling class criminals accountable? My answer is yes. And now half of the viewers have probably said, Glenn, you're full of baloney, because we're not seeing a lot of accountability coming to Donald Trump. But I always have to ask folks to take a step back and remember where we were when Trump won the last presidential election. We were in the process of challenging corrupt Judge Aileen Cannon's dismissal of the classified documents case, challenging it in the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. And let me tell you, Jack Smith's team would have won that challenge. The case would have been returned to the trial court, probably with the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals ordering that it not go back to Judge Cannon, but rather go to a fair, independent, impartial judge, because the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals had previously reversed, I would call it a smackdown, reversed Judge Cannon twice previously for abusing her judicial discretion in favor of Donald Trump. I mean, I still have a hard time absorbing that she was not removed from the classified documents case earlier. But that case was in active litigation. It would have been returned and it would have gone forward because it wouldn't enjoy presidential immunity. These were crimes Donald Trump was indicted for after he left the presidency. No presidential immunity for that. Where were we in the January 6th case? There were 4 felony charges indicted against Donald Trump. True, a compromised Supreme Court rewrote the Constitution and gave him absolute immunity, but only for one category of crimes that he committed as part of his core constitutional functions, like sending the military to kill his political opponents. For some reason, 6 justices of the Supreme Court thought that was a good idea, to give a president, free rein, leeway, a get-out-of-jail-free card for ordering the military to kill his political opponents. Again, I don't know this world that we're living in right now, Brian. But there were 2 other categories of presidential crimes. One, crimes that a president commits in his official capacity enjoys a presumption of immunity, but the prosecutors can rebut that presumption. And perhaps most importantly, private acts of a candidate, like a candidate who was aggrieved because he lost an election, so he committed crimes to try to unlawfully retain the power of the presidency. There is no immunity for those crimes. And I maintain the J6 crimes for which Donald Trump was indicted fall into that 3rd category. Where were we in that case? We were in front of Judge Tanya Chutkan litigating the precise issues that I just laid out in these 3 categories of crimes. And that case would have proceeded to trial. Wouldn't have been quick, wouldn't have been easy. We were in the process, the judiciary, but for the 6 compromised Supreme Court justices, the judiciary writ large was in the process of holding Donald Trump accountable. And it was only because he got elected president and DOJ has deigned that you can't prosecute a sitting criminal president, but you can once he leaves office. We're not done by a long shot. And the judiciary was holding strong with a few notable exceptions, Aileen Cannon and some of the Supreme Court justices. I still believe to my core, Brian, I was in the business of a federal prosecutor for 30 years. I still believe to my core the federal judiciary is up to the task, and if given the opportunity, and the way it will be given the opportunity is if, Donald Trump falls from power, hopefully, even before the end of his 4-year term at the rate he's going. I don't wish him any harm, and I'm always, talking about how we have to fight peacefully to make sure he gets dethroned at the earliest possible moment. But once he falls from power, we should be back in the business of holding Donald Trump accountable for his crimes. So in the most long-winded answer I've ever given you, yes, I have faith and confidence that the judiciary remains up to the task.
The difficult part for me to process is we are told that the American judicial system is like the gold standard, right? And then we see this kind of stuff happen at the hands of Donald Trump. We see the judiciary unable to see his prosecution through to the end. And then just like that, we see Brazil prosecute and imprison, their criminal leaders. We see it in South Korea, like these other countries who don't beat their chests as these behemoths of law and order, these beacons of virtue and integrity. Like they're just regular other countries around the world that are able to do what somehow eludes us in this shining city on a hill in America.
Brian, I don't even think I would call the U.S. of A. one of the regular old countries. I think we have fallen beneath the expectation of a civilized country, and we should look to and learn from the other countries that have decided, apparently, I think we can throw France into that category as well, decided that they are determined to hold folk accountable, even if those people are rich, powerful, influential, connected. Other countries have decided, no, the rule of law will apply to those folk as well. And they go about using the same system they use against everybody else, and they hold them accountable. We are falling so far beneath that sort of, basic sort of responsibility of a civilized nation that, we are going to need to kind of dig ourselves out of this hole and restore, the public's faith in our ability to treat everybody equally under the law.
Look, I'm grateful for your voice and hopefully getting us back to that point at some juncture in the future. So for those who are watching, again, if you'd like to support our work, elevate our voices, the best way to do that is to subscribe. I'm going to put the links to both of our channels right here on the screen. So if you're not yet subscribed, please go ahead and hit the subscribe button. Completely free to do so, but again, a great way to support us and independent media. I'm Brian Teller Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.
Hey, Vsauce, Michael here. Do you have a best friend who is there for you 24/7, 365? Sorry, that's not really good enough. If your friend truly had your back, they would be there for you 24/0000067365.2421891. Also, George Washington was born on February 22nd, 1732. At least, that's what we're told. However, his family Bible says he was born on February 11th, 1731/2. So, which is it, Mr. I cannot tell a lie? Oh, and don't even ask about 1752. In Russia, 1752 looked pretty normal. But check out what the British Empire was up to that year. Nothing really out of the ordinary, except Ember. The 2nd was followed by the 14th. Were 11 days just deleted? Where'd they go? What happened then? It is time to question time and how the Earth moves. Reconciling both of these things has led to some pretty strange things. We all love time-lapse videos of the stars moving across the sky, but really, we are the ones who are moving, tumbling through the universe on a giant, wet rock vehicle called Earth with a windshield called the sky. As viewed from above the North Pole, we spin counterclockwise. West chases east. I always remember this by thinking of the US as a weird, mane-headed animal with Texas and Florida legs running forward. But we don't just spin. We also revolve around the sun on a plane tilted 23.4 degrees relative to our spin. It's kind of nauseating at this scale. But from this perspective, you can see that the sun rising and setting is just the Earth pointing you towards and then away from the sun. This motion causes your sunrise, your noon, the moment when the sun is highest in your sky, before your sunset. To more closely investigate this movement, let's talk about meridians. You are on one at this very moment. Your meridian is just a line from where you are right now, straight towards the North and South poles. It's a line of longitude, as opposed to the horizontal lines that lay flat when north or south is up that we call flatitude, or actually, latitude. The sun is highest in the sky to you, your noon, when your meridian is pointed right at the sun. A cool thing happens at this moment. All shadows around you point directly towards one of Earth's poles, unless you're on the subsolar point. The subsolar point is the point on Earth's surface directly below the sun. It's always somewhere. You can check its current location online, links as always in the description. On the subsolar point, shadows fall straight down so they can easily disappear. Twice a year, the subsolar point crosses over Hawaii, the only place in the US where it hits land. And when it does, it is called Lahaina Noon, meaning cruel sun. Straight vertical objects look unnatural during this brief time, like they don't belong, as if they were photoshopped in without regard for reality. In Honolulu, a sculpture by Isamu Noguchi called Skygate casts a twisted shadow all day, every day, except during Lahaina Noon, when its shadow is a perfect circle. You may not live in a place where the sun ever appears directly overhead, but once every Earth rotation, the subsolar point falls somewhere on your meridian, making it noon for you. The technical name for this noon for you is local apparent solar noon. The clock on your wrist and the clock on your phone don't tell you your local apparent solar time, because long ago we realized that if every meridian had its own time, a person just a few kilometers away, seeing different shadows than you did, would disagree with you on what time it was. So towns adopted their own time. Now later on, this trick was standardized and time zones as we know them today came about. But that's not all we didn't like about shadow-based sundial time. To explore deeper, we have to begin by asking, what's a day? I mean, obviously it's just the time it takes the Earth to turn around once, right? But according to what? Everything else in space is moving in some way too. The universe doesn't include a convenient sheet of graph paper at absolute rest we can trace paths on. The best we can do on that front is to look at very, very far, far, far away stars. So far away, like distant features of the landscape out the window of a moving car, they barely move as Earth does. Now, to them, a meridian on Earth completes a trip around about once every 23.9 hours. This is called a sidereal day. Sidereal means pertaining to the stars. Even though the sidereal day seems pretty clear, it's not what our calendars and clocks are based on, because there's a nearer star whose position relative to us has a bigger effect on our lives: the sun. Looking down on the North Pole at Earth's counterclockwise spin, the Earth also moves counterclockwise around the sun. After a sidereal day, the Earth has moved a bit along its orbit, so some more rotation is required for the same meridian to point back towards the sun again. This longer definition of one rotation is what the modern calendar and clock is based on. It is called the solar day. But here's the thing. Exactly how long the Earth has to rotate to complete a solar day changes day to day. Our clocks are just based on the average amount of time this takes. So throughout the year, they fall ahead and behind the sun. This is a solograph, a picture of the sun's path across the sky every single day. If our clocks actually told us local apparent solar time, if you took a picture of the sky every day at noon, you should get a line of suns. But this is what really happens. Over the course of a year, it will appear as though your clock is running slow, and then fast, and then slow again, and then fast again. This problem was known since at least ancient times, even if its cause wasn't. In order to reconcile the two, the equation of time was constructed. In this sense, equation means to reconcile. The equation of time was applied to what a clock said in order to compute the real time, the solar time a sundial would show. Now, some fancy clocks, called equation clocks, were made that would do this for you, but eventually, we gave up. We gave up and just said, no, the real time isn't what the sun says, it's what our inventions say. Now, this transition was a big one. It was humanity growing up. It was like the first time you realize you're stronger than your parents. We realized our timepieces were more regular and turned our backs on the timepieces nature had. But what causes this disagreement in the first place? As it turns out, the answer revolves around revolving, the way the Earth revolves around the sun. If the equator faced the sun all the time and the Earth always orbited at the same speed, the subsolar point would just stay right there on the equator throughout the year, and the amount of extra time spent rotating the Earth needed to do to finish a solar day would always be the same. But those two things aren't the case. First of all, the Earth's orbit is slightly elliptical, so its speed varies throughout the year. When it's moving around the sun faster around the beginning of January, the amount of extra turning time needed to complete the solar day is longer than when it's further away from the sun and moving more slowly. There's more. Because the Earth is tilted, the subsolar point is dragged throughout the year in a circle around Earth that's not the equator, so it changes direction, moving northeast, then leveling out and going southeast, before leveling out and going northeast again. During times of the year when the subsolar point is being dragged by Earth's orbit mostly east, it gains against Earth's spin faster. More time is required for the day to finish. Now, by coincidence, we are alive at a time when both of these phenomena lengthen and shorten days at roughly the same time. So they add up, making September 18th almost a minute shorter than the longest day of the year, December 22nd. For Northern Hemispherians, December has the shortest periods of daylight, but the whole solar day, from sunrise to sunrise, is for everyone on Earth the longest of the year on December 22nd. People in the north just spend most of it in darkness. Earth's tilt doesn't just affect how long a day is, it also affects how long a year is. This is because the Earth's tilt is what causes the seasons. For the half of the Earth tilted towards the sun, the same amount of solar radiation is spread across less space than it is on the other half, so there's more heat energy laid down per area. This causes what we call summer and winter for the other half. The amount of time from one of these seasonal orientations of the Earth to its occurrence again is called a solar year, or a tropical year. It's a very useful way to define a year because it contains every single season exactly, since it's based on the very orientations that cause them. But the problem is this: the number of solar days that occur in a solar year is not a whole number. It's almost 365. But after that many solar days, about a quarter of a day more happens before the solar year starts again. This makes designing a calendar more like designing a calendar. If your calendar only ever has 365 days in a year, over time, those dates will drift from the seasonal positions they used to occur during. Unless, this extra quarter of a turn adds up to a full day after 4 years. See, March 1st is coming a day too soon now, so if we just delay March by adding an extra day at the end of February every 4 years, a leap day, we're back on track. Leap days do not add days to your life. You're still going to live the same number of them. They just change what we call them. But really, who cares about being 1 day earlier every 4 years? I mean, 1 day isn't much, you'd hardly notice it. But over time, well, if America's founders had declared not only independence from Britain, but also from leap days, and abolished them from happening, today, 240 years later, their calendar would be a full 2 months ahead of Earth's position, putting America's coldest winter days in April and its hottest summer days in October. Adding a day every 4 years is what the famous Julian calendar does. Introduced in 46 BC by Julius Caesar, it was the de facto standardized Western calendar for a very long time, more than a millennium. But it's not perfect. Look closely. Leap days actually move the calendar just slightly too far each time, because I lied. 365¼ solar days don't occur within 1 solar year. The real number is slightly less and fluctuates year to year based on long-term changes to Earth and the Sun's movements, which means adding 1 day every 4 years is just a teensy too many. By 1582, Julian calendar dates were 10 days behind the seasons compared to where they used to be. Now, that's not bad, 10 days in more than a millennium and a half. But the Catholic Church cared because they wanted Easter to occur exactly when it used to centuries ago. Astronomers at the time realized that if leap days pushed the calendar too far behind the seasons, we would just need to celebrate fewer of them to fix the problem. Specifically, we would need 3 fewer leap days every 4 centuries. The rule they wrote to achieve this stated that every 4 years would continue to be a leap year, except if it was divisible by 100, unless it was also evenly divisible by 400. This removes 3 every 400 years. On October 4th, Pope Gregory XIII introduced this new calendar. It took his name, the Gregorian calendar. He also undid the drift that had occurred since the early days of the Julian and declared on October 4th that tomorrow would be October 15th. October 5th to the 4th.
Donald Trump's press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, seems to be losing her spark. She has stuck with Trump through thick and thin, an inverse reality on the worst days of this administration. From the execution of U.S. citizens to the stripping of USAID, which will lead to 14 million deaths, to the cutting of Medicaid for tens of millions of Americans. Caroline Leavitt has been there defending Donald Trump every step of the way. And today, was not very different, but there is a new resigned vibe that Caroline Leavitt began to give at the very end of this press conference. In one of the clips, she says, "I honestly don't have any updates for you on that today." And the next one, she goes, "I don't have any announcements or updates. I haven't even read the full Wall Street Journal article that you're talking about." Just a resigned Caroline Leavitt. And it could be because just last night, the DHS spokesperson, Tricia McLaughlin, who is kind of like the Caroline Leavitt for Kristi Noem, if that makes sense. So the Department of Homeland Security has their own press secretary, and their own press secretary was also a young blonde woman who would be conventionally attractive in conservative spaces, who could go out there and just inverse reality. Well, that DHS spokesperson left just last night. The move comes as public opinion has turned on the administration's hardline immigration policy. So she's gone, and now Caroline Leavitt is out there fighting for her life on her own. If you appreciate these videos, drop a like and subscribe, and let's jump in with this clip where Caroline Leavitt already gives a really dumb, resigned answer. She gets asked about striking Iran. And essentially, we struck them 6 months ago. Trump claimed we would never have to strike again, that we eliminated their nuclear capacity. And now she gets asked, why are we about to strike Iran's nukes again if it's already eliminated? Caroline goes, there are many arguments I could make.
Thank you, Michael.
John.
Garrett.
On Iran, I'm not asking you for like military secrets here, but can you share?
Know I would be on why.
Unless you want to give them. Can you share a little bit about the president's thinking on whether or not to strike Iran, who he's talking to, what information he's consuming, and why a strike might be necessary on a nuclear program he says was obliterated by the last U.S. strike?
Well, there's many reasons and arguments that one could make for a strike against Iran. The president had a very successful operation as commander-in-chief with Operation Midnight Hammer, as you know, as you just said, totally obliterated Iran's nuclear facilities. The president has always been very clear, though, with respect to Iran or any country around the world, diplomacy is always his first option, and Iran would be very wise to make a deal with President Trump.
This is absolutely disgusting rhetoric. You want to know the reality of what happened? Donald Trump posted a Truth Social post claiming that if Iranian citizens went out and protested against the regime, that the U.S. would have their back. The U.S. would use force and have the back of these protesters, that they have nothing to worry about. So people went out and protested en masse in Iran, and 38,000 civilians were killed by the government, and Trump did absolutely nothing. So this was a series of missteps and blunders. I'm not arguing that Donald Trump should be striking Iran. I'm arguing that he killed people by setting false expectations and then not following through. Caroline Leavitt refuses to mention that, and she's not asked about that when she very well should be.
And with this administration, he's talking to many people. Of course, his national security team.
He's talking to many people. There are many answers she could give. These are all just platitudes when Donald Trump led to thousands, tens of thousands of deaths. Okay, let's go over to Gaza. We talked about the Middle East regarding Iran. Let's go over to Gaza. Caroline Leavitt gets asked about the Board of Peace and who is leading it. Take a listen.
Sure.
Thank you so much. Following up on Gaza, this $5 billion, who exactly will be in charge of managing this money? Would that be the president himself making the final decisions on how these funds are spent?
It will be the Board of Peace, which the president is, of course, the chairman of, but all of the member parties, I believe, will have votes on the funding. And then, of course, there is that technocratic layer underneath the official Board of Peace with the member countries that will be making decisions as well. So if you just go back and look at the first event that we had where we sort of unveiled the structure of the Board of Peace, that structure remains in place and they'll be overseeing the funds that will...
Oh my Lord. So if you remember, the Board of Peace comprises of Donald Trump, Netanyahu, I think Viktor Orban might have been invited, while they said Macron of France can't be invited, just an inverse of reality. And the Board of Peace is the de facto ruler of the Gaza Strip. So Donald Trump is essentially currently the president of the Gaza Strip, even though he can't even manage the United States. It is just absolutely sickening. And I want to remind you that the peace deal Donald Trump tried to push through between Israel and Gaza a few months back dissolved the next day. Hamas was shooting people in the Gaza Strip, any dissidents, and Israel continued to strike, starve, and ethnically cleanse the Gaza Strip while doing illegal settlements in the West Bank. So Israel has not been reined in. The war in Gaza has not officially stopped. It's kind of slowed down to a halt. But to continue right here, Levitt then claims she's just interested in seeing flourishing democracies across the hemisphere.
Thank you so much. Can I ask on Cuba something? Sure. On Cuba, it's increasingly being described as a humanitarian crisis. What is a successful outcome for the U.S. that the U.S. wants to see in Cuba? Is there anything less than regime change that would be considered success?
I think, as Secretary Rubio has articulated, and the president himself, we obviously want to see flourishing and prosperous democracies all over the world, especially in our own hemisphere.
Lord have mercy. Isn't this exactly what Bush said, that we're just going to go spread democracy in the Middle East? Maybe we should improve upon or reform the democratic system in the United States to make sure that people like Trump and Elon Musk can't game it before we focus on nation building in other countries. But I do want to point out a theme between the clips that we've watched thus far. There's more clips to play, but look at this. The first one was about Iran and about the nuclear program. Then she gets asked about Gaza and about the $5 billion. Then she gets asked about Cuba. This is all just foreign policy questions. Donald Trump has deprioritized domestic policy. He's not putting forward any massively beneficial policies for the American people. In fact, he's screwing over the most vulnerable Americans while focusing disproportionately on foreign policy. Even when we're talking about domestic policy, Caroline Levitt gets asked about Donald Trump posting racist pictures. Listen to this.
One other question then. Yesterday in his statement about Jesse Jackson, the president said, despite the fact that I'm falsely and consistently called a racist by the scoundrels and lunatics on the radical left, Democrats all, it was always my pleasure to help Jesse along the way. Where or when does the president believe he's been falsely called racist?
You're kidding, right? No. I will pull you plethora of examples. I'm going to get my team in that room to start going through the internet of radical Democrats throughout the years, Ed, who have accused this president falsely of being a racist. And I'm sure there's many people in this room and on network television across the country who have accused him of the same. In fact, I know that because I've seen it with my own eyes. And the president very much looks forward to having an event later this afternoon at 3 p.m. to celebrate Black History Month and to talk about how his policies are advancing opportunity.
Lord have mercy. On like the 4th day of Black History Month, he posted an AI video of the Obamas as gorillas. The question was worded in such a way where Caroline Levitt took offense because she was like, oh, I'll show you so many times the president has been called racist. But the question was, when has he falsely been called a racist? Because every single time someone does throw the accusation of racism at Donald Trump, it's usually because he either A, said that Obama wasn't born in America because he's black, B, made Obama and his wife out as gorillas in an AI video, C, restricted housing to black people like back in the 70s and 80s when the DOJ decided to go after him. I mean, these allegations are made for a reason. I didn't even mention the Central Park 5 example. There are many, many other examples. And then a Fox News reporter asks a question about America 250.
To your point about that, there are a lot of events coming up for America 250. The president wants people from all over to come to the nation's capital. Is he worried that by the summer, the Potomac River will still smell like poop?
He is worried about that, which is why the federal government wants to fix it. And
Notice how nobody in the room really laughed. I heard more laughs earlier from a very serious question. Now, here's where Caroline Levitt kind of begins to just be resigned. Her answer to this question literally is, I don't have any updates for you.
One more. Go ahead.
Last week we saw the underlying affidavit for the search warrant that was executed in Fulton County, and there was not any mention in that document about foreign election interference in the 2020 election. I'm wondering if DNI Gabbard has uncovered that in Georgia or in Puerto Rico, where we know her team was sent as well.
I don't have any updates for you on that today. I would defer you to the director's office herself.
No updates, meaning she doesn't have any spin, she doesn't have any lies. In this one, she says, I don't have any updates either.
Sure.
Two questions. One, on the president's schedule today, it says he has signing time. What is he signing today? Are we expecting executive orders or actions? That's the first question. And then second, the Wall Street Journal is reporting that a U.S. arms sale package for Taiwan is in limbo. Can you just confirm this reporting / offer any additional comment? And how concerned is the administration that if an arms deal with Taiwan went through, that this could disrupt the China-U.S. Trade truce?
Sure. Well, I haven't read the full Wall Street Journal report. I will just say with respect to an arms sale to Taiwan, I don't have any announcements or updates on that for you today.
Again, no ability to spin it. I'm going to leave it there. If you appreciate these videos, drop a like, subscribe. I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.
House Democrats continue to release their own Epstein documents. So, what's in this latest drop? Is it emails?